Our first story comes from someone who learned that being followed isn't always just paranoia. The man who followed me home from the bus stop, posted by OP. I work downtown and usually take the bus home around 6 p.m. when my shift ends. It's normally a pretty routine commute, about 20 minutes from the city centre to my neighbourhood. Last Tuesday was different though, and I'm still processing what happened. I got off at my usual stop and started the 5-minute walk to my apartment building. About halfway there, I noticed this guy walking behind me. At first I didn't think much of it because lots of people get off at that stop, but something felt off about his pace. He was walking just slow enough to stay about 10 feet behind me, but whenever I sped up or slowed down, he'd match it perfectly. I decided to test my suspicions by taking a detour. Instead of turning left toward my building, I kept walking straight for another block. Sure enough, he followed. My heart started racing because this was definitely not normal behaviour. I could hear his footsteps echoing mine on the empty sidewalk. There's a corner convenience store about 3 blocks from my apartment that stays open late, so I ducked inside hoping he'd just keep walking, and I could wait him out. The owner knows me pretty well since I stop in there sometimes for milk or snacks, so I pretended to browse the chip aisle while keeping an eye on the windows. Through the glass, I watched this guy stop right outside the store. He wasn't even pretending to look at his phone or anything. He just stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the entrance. He was maybe in his 40s, average height, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Nothing particularly memorable about him except for the fact that he was obviously waiting for me to come back out. I stayed inside for about 15 minutes, buying a soda I didn't want and making small talk with the owner. The guy never left. He moved around a little, sometimes leaning against a street sign, sometimes walking in small circles, but his eyes were always on that store entrance. Finally, I asked the store owner if I could use his phone to call a friend. I explained the situation, and he was really understanding about it. He said he'd noticed the guy too, and thought it was weird. My friend Sarah lives about 10 minutes away, so I called her and asked if she could come pick me up. While I was waiting for Sarah, the store owner kept glancing outside and updating me on where the guy was. At one point, he walked closer to the windows and tried to peer inside, which absolutely confirmed that he was looking for me specifically. The store owner asked if I wanted him to call the police, but I figured once my friend arrived, we could just drive away, and that would be the end of it. Sarah pulled up about 20 minutes later, and I quickly explained what was happening. She parked right in front of the store, and I made a run for her car. As soon as I got in and we started driving away, I looked back and saw the guy walking quickly toward where her car had been parked. He was definitely trying to follow us, but Sarah took a few random turns and we lost him pretty easily. We drove around for another 10 minutes, just to be safe. Then she dropped me off at my building. I've been taking different routes home from work since then, and I haven't seen him again. But the whole thing really shook me up. I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd just walked straight home like normal, or if that store hadn't been open. The scariest part is that he seemed so determined. He waited outside that store for over 30 minutes, just hoping I'd come back out. That's not casual curiosity or coincidence, that's someone with a plan, and I have no idea what that plan was. That story is over. The persistence is what really gets to me here. 15 minutes of following someone could be coincidental, but waiting outside a store for over half an hour shows serious intent. Thank goodness for that store owner who was paying attention and willing to help. It's terrifying to think about what might have happened if our narrator had just walked straight home that night. Let's move on to our next story, which takes us back to when one of our storytellers was just a child, the stranger who tried to lure me with candy. This happened when I was 9 years old, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was visiting my mum's house for the weekend. She lived in this quiet suburban neighbourhood where all the houses had these long driveways and big front yards with plenty of trees. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was playing outside in my mum's front yard, just running around and picking up interesting rocks like kids do. My mum was inside making lunch, and had told me to stay where she could see me from the kitchen window. I was crouched down looking at this cool, shiny rock I'd found when I heard a car slow down on the street. When I looked up, there was this old sedan parked right at the end of our driveway. The driver had rolled down his window and was leaning out toward me. He looked like he was maybe in his 50s or 60s, with greying hair and glasses. He had this really wide smile that seemed fake somehow, like he was trying too hard to look friendly. He was wearing a button-up shirt that looked too formal for just driving around on a weekend. "Hey there, sweetie," he called out to me. "I've got some really good candy in my car. Do you want to come see?" Even at 9 years old, I knew this was exactly the kind of situation my parents had warned me about. Every kid knows you don't take candy from strangers, especially strangers in cars. But what made it even more obvious was how he said it. His voice had this weird sing-song quality to it, like he was talking to a much younger child. I just stood there holding my rock, not moving toward him, but not running away yet either. I was kind of frozen because, even though I knew this was wrong, it was still scary to have an adult stranger talking to me. "I've got chocolate bars and lollipops," he continued, still with that fake smile. "All kinds of good stuff. Why don't you come over here and pick out what you want?" That's when I noticed he was gesturing with his hand for me to come closer to the car. He wasn't just offering candy. He was actively trying to get me to approach his vehicle. The way he kept emphasizing how good the candy was and how I could pick out whatever I wanted felt like he was reading from some kind of script. I finally found my voice and said, "No, thank you. I'm not supposed to talk to strangers." His smile faltered for just a second, and something about his expression changed. It wasn't friendly anymore. He looked almost annoyed that I wasn't falling for whatever he was trying to do. "Oh, come on," he said, his voice a little sharper now. "I'm not a stranger. I'm a friend. Friends share candy with each other. Your mum won't mind." The fact that he mentioned my mum made my stomach drop. How did he know I was here visiting my mum? Had he been watching our house? I realised this wasn't just some random guy driving by who decided to offer candy to a kid. This felt planned somehow. I dropped the rock and ran as fast as I could toward the front door, yelling, "Mom! Mom!" at the top of my lungs. I could hear the car engine revving behind me as I ran. Like maybe he was thinking about pulling into our driveway, but by the time I reached the porch, I heard him drive away quickly. My mum came running out because she could hear the panic in my voice. When I told her what happened, her face went completely white. She immediately called the police and gave them a description of the man and his car. She also called my dad and several neighbours to let them know what had happened. The police came out and took a report, but they said without a license plate number, it would be hard to track down the guy. They did increase patrols in our neighbourhood for the next few weeks, which made everyone feel a little safer. My mum was really shaken up by the whole thing. She kept saying she should have been watching more closely, but honestly, she was right there in the kitchen. The whole interaction probably only lasted 2 or 3 minutes. It's not like she left me unsupervised for hours. What bothers me most looking back is how calculated it felt. He didn't just happen to have candy in his car, he specifically mentioned multiple types of candy and kept emphasizing that I could choose what I wanted. That sounds like someone who had done this before and knew exactly what to say to tempt a kid. I never saw him again after that day, but for months afterward, I was nervous about playing outside alone. Every time a car would slow down near our house, I'd run inside just to be safe. Even now as an adult, I still remember exactly what he looked like and how his voice sounded when he was trying to convince me to come closer to his car. That story's over. The calculated nature of this approach is what makes it so chilling. This wasn't some impulsive offer. This was someone who clearly had a system and knew exactly what to say to children. The fact that he mentioned her mum and tried to normalise the interaction shows he'd probably done this before. Emily's instincts and her parents' safety lessons absolutely saved her that day. Our next story comes from someone who experienced something unsettling during a late-night gas station stop. The creepy guy at the gas station, posted by Anonymous. This happened about 6 months ago, but it still gives me chills when I think about it. I was driving home from visiting friends in another city and it was getting pretty late, around 11 p.m. My gas tank was almost empty, so I had to stop at this station on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the nicest area, but it was well lit and there were a few other cars around, so I felt reasonably safe. I pulled up to a pump and got out to start filling up my tank. The night was pretty quiet except for the usual traffic sounds from the nearby highway. I was just standing there waiting for the tank to fill, scrolling through my phone to pass the time, when I became aware that someone was standing really close to me. I looked up and there was this guy who had somehow appeared right next to my car without me hearing him approach. He was maybe in his 30s, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that made him blend into the shadows. What immediately made me uncomfortable was how close he was standing. I mean, there were plenty of other pumps available, and he wasn't even at a pump himself. He was just standing there next to my car, way inside my personal space. "Nice car," he said in this low voice, almost like he was whispering, even though we were the only ones around. The way he said it didn't sound like a normal compliment. It sounded possessive somehow, like he was evaluating it. I just nodded and said thanks, while trying to focus on the gas pump display, hoping he would take the hint and move away. But instead of leaving, he stepped even closer. Now he was close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke on his clothes. "What year is it?" he asked, still in that weird whisper voice. He was looking at my car, but I could feel his eyes moving to look at me too. The whole situation felt wrong, like he was using the car as an excuse to start a conversation for some other reason. I told him it was a 2018 model, keeping my answers short and not making eye contact. I get back in my car and leave, but there was really hoping the gas would finish pumping soon, so I still had a few more minutes. "You live around here?" he asked next, and that's when I really started to panic. That's not the kind of question you ask someone at a gas station, unless you have ulterior motives. I could feel my heart rate picking up and my hands getting sweaty. I said no, I was just passing through, which was technically true since I didn't live in that immediate area. I was hoping that would discourage him from asking more personal questions, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. "Where are you headed?" he pressed, taking another small step closer. Now he was close enough that if I needed to get to my driver's side door, he would be blocking my path. I started to realize that his positioning might not be accidental. I gave him a vague answer about visiting family, but I was starting to feel trapped. The gas pump seemed to be taking forever, and this guy was clearly not going to leave me alone. I started looking around to see if there were other people nearby who might help if I needed it. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His car was parked not at a pump, but in a regular parking spot near the store, which meant he hadn't come over to get gas. He had come over specifically to talk to me. He had been watching me from his car and had walked over with the intention of starting this conversation. The gas pump finally clicked off, and I quickly hung up the nozzle and started walking toward the driver's side of my car. But as I moved, he moved too, staying close to me and continuing to ask questions. "You sure you don't live around here? I feel like I've seen you before," he said, which was impossible since I'd never been to that gas station in my life. I think he was trying to create some kind of false familiarity to make me let my guard down. I got to my car door and had my keys ready, but he was standing close enough that I couldn't open the door without bumping into him. I finally looked directly at him and said firmly, "Excuse me, I need to get in my car." For a moment, he just stared at me with this weird expression, like he was deciding what to do next. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like he thought the whole situation was amusing somehow. "Have a safe drive," he said, but he still didn't move away from me again before he finally stepped back just enough for my door. I had to say, "Excuse the doors," immediately and started the engine, as me to get into my car. I was still standing there watching my car. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw him. I was completely out of the parking lot. He went to go back to his own vehicle until whole drive home. I kept checking my mirrors too. I even took a few extra turns just to be safe, make sure he wasn't following me. When I got home, I sat one had tailed me. I was in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside, just to make sure I stopped at plenty of gas stations late at night, and I've never had an interaction like that before. Most people mind their own business, get their gas, and leave. This guy was clearly looking for an opportunity to approach a woman who was alone, and he used my car as an excuse to start a conversation that quickly became invasive and threatening. That story is over. The strategic positioning and escalating personal questions show this wasn't just awkward small talk. This was someone who knew exactly how to corner someone and make them feel trapped. The fact that he parked away from the pumps and walked over specifically to approach her makes it clear this was predatory behavior. Sometimes trusting that uncomfortable feeling in your gut is the difference between a close call and something much worse. Let's move on to our next story, which involves someone discovering they were being watched in their own home. The neighbour who stared into my window. Posted by Daniel. I moved into my apartment about a year ago. It's a ground floor unit in a small complex with maybe 8 apartments total. I chose it specifically because it had a nice big bedroom window that faces the courtyard area, and I liked being able to look out at the trees and landscaping. My neighbour across the courtyard is this guy who looks to be in his 50s, lives alone, and generally keeps to himself. I'd see him occasionally, coming and going, and we'd nod hello if we passed each other, but we never really had conversations. He seemed harmless enough, just a quiet older guy. About 3 months after I moved in, I started noticing that his living room light would be on late at night, and sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him standing near his window. I didn't think much of it at first because people have different sleep schedules, and maybe he was just looking outside or watching TV. But over the next few weeks, I started to realise that every time I looked toward his apartment, he seemed to be standing at his window. Not just occasionally, but consistently, like he was spending hours just standing there looking out. I tried to convince myself it was just coincidence. Maybe he was having trouble sleeping, or maybe he liked to look at the courtyard at night. But then I started paying closer attention to when I'd see him there, and I realised it seemed to correlate with when my lights were on. If I was in my bedroom with the lights on, he'd be at his window. If I turned off my bedroom light and went to the kitchen, within a few minutes, I'd see him move to a different window in his apartment that had a view of my kitchen area. It was like he was tracking which rooms I was in. The thing that really confirmed my suspicions happened about a month ago. It was around 2 a.m. and I couldn't sleep, so I got up to get a glass of water. I didn't turn on any lights because I didn't want to fully wake myself up. As I walked past my bedroom window, I glanced outside and there he was, standing at his window in the dark. His apartment was completely dark too, but I could see his silhouette against the faint light from the courtyard lamps. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing my bedroom window. There was no TV glow, no phone light, nothing that would explain why he was awake and standing at his window at 2 a.m. That's when I realised he wasn't just casually looking outside, he was specifically watching my apartment, probably trying to see into my windows. The thought of him standing there in the dark, watching my bedroom while I slept, made me feel sick. I started closing my blinds every night after that, but somehow knowing he was probably still out there watching made me really uncomfortable. I'd lie in bed wondering if he was standing at his window, staring at my closed blinds and waiting for me to open them. Last week, something happened that took this to a whole new level of creepy. We'd been having some heavy rain for a few days, and I was woken up around 3 a.m. by thunder. I got up to close my window because rain was starting to blow in, and when I looked outside, I couldn't believe what I saw. He was standing in the courtyard, not in his apartment, not on his balcony, but actually outside in the rain. He was maybe 20 feet from my bedroom window, just standing there in the pouring rain, staring directly at my window. I immediately ducked away from the window and grabbed my phone to call the police. This had gone way beyond just looking out his own window. This was him actually coming outside in the middle of the night to get closer to my apartment. While I was on the phone with 911, I carefully peered out through my blinds to see if he was still there. He was, and he hadn't moved at all. He was completely soaked from the rain, but he just stood there like a statue staring at my bedroom window. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, and by then he had gone back inside his apartment. When they knocked on his door, he answered and claimed he had just stepped outside to check on his car because of the storm. But his car is parked on the complete opposite side of the complex from where he was standing. The officers took a report and said they'd patrol the area more frequently, but they couldn't arrest him for common area for all residents. They did talk standing in the courtyard since it's technically to him about respecting neighbours' privacy, and they said if I saw him doing it again, I should call immediately. Since then, I've been keeping my blinds closed all the time, and I'm looking for a new place to live. I shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable in my own bedroom, but knowing he's right across the courtyard, probably still watching my windows, makes it impossible to relax. The worst part is wondering how long this had been going on before I noticed. Had he been watching me from the very beginning? Did he choose his apartment specifically because it had a good view of other units? I keep thinking about all the times I walked around my apartment without being aware that someone might be watching. I've talked to a couple of other neighbours about it, and one woman said she'd also noticed him standing at his window a lot, but she hadn't thought much of it either. Now we're both wondering if he's been watching multiple apartments, or if I was specifically targeted for some reason. The whole situation has made me paranoid about privacy in ways I never was before. I find myself checking my windows obsessively and worrying about what other neighbours might be able to see into my apartment. It's exhausting to feel like you're being watched in your own home. That story is over. The escalation from window watching to standing outside in the rain shows this wasn't casual nosiness, but genuine stalking behaviour. The fact that he was tracking which rooms Daniel was in and positioning himself accordingly shows a disturbing level of premeditation. Having someone violate your sense of safety in your own home is one of the most unsettling experiences imaginable. Our next story takes us to a parking lot encounter that started helpful, but quickly became something much more sinister. The man in the grocery store parking lot, posted by OP. I do my grocery shopping every Sunday afternoon at this big supermarket near my house. It's usually pretty busy, which I like because there are always people around, and it feels safe. Last Sunday started out completely normal, just me doing my weekly shopping and loading up on the usual stuff. I had filled my cart pretty full because I was stocking up for the week, and by the time I got to the checkout line, I had about 15 bags of groceries. The cashier helped me get everything into my cart, and I headed out to the parking lot to load up my car. I had parked toward the back of the lot because it was crowded when I arrived, so I had to walk a little ways to get to my car. As I was pushing the cart across the parking lot, I noticed this guy walking parallel to me about 2 rows over. He was maybe in his 40s, wearing a baseball cap and a dark jacket, and he seemed to be timing his walk to match mine. When I got to my car and started loading bags into my trunk, I could see him in my peripheral vision. He had stopped walking and was just standing next to this white van, pretending to look at his phone. But I could tell he was actually watching me, because every time I'd look in his direction, he'd quickly look away. I had gotten about half my bags loaded when he suddenly appeared right next to my car. I jumped a little because I hadn't seen him walk over, which meant he must have moved pretty quickly while I was bent over loading groceries. "Let me help you with those," he said, reaching for one of my grocery bags before I could respond. His voice was friendly enough, but something about the way he positioned himself felt wrong. He was standing between me and my driver's side door, and he was closer to me than a stranger should be. I told him thanks, but I had it handled, but he didn't back away. Instead, he grabbed another bag from my cart and said, "No problem, I insist. These look heavy." He wasn't asking for permission. He was just taking my groceries and putting them somewhere I couldn't see what he was doing with them. That's when I realized he wasn't putting the bags in my trunk like I expected. He was walking toward the white van he'd been standing next to earlier, carrying my groceries with him. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Oh, I parked right over here, much closer for you." I told him those were my groceries and I needed them in my car, not his van. But instead of apologizing and bringing the bags back, he kept walking toward the van and said, "Come on, it'll be easier if you just come over here. I can give you a ride home too if you want." Now I was getting seriously alarmed because this guy had my groceries and was trying to get me to walk over to his vehicle. I raised my voice and said, "I don't need a ride. I have my own car right here. Please bring my groceries back." He had reached his van by this point and was opening the back doors. I could see inside and it looked like the seats had been removed or folded down, so it was just an empty cargo area. He put my grocery bags inside and then turned back to me with this smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just come take a look," he said. "I think you'll like what I've got in here." The way he said it made my skin crawl, because it was clear he wasn't talking about groceries anymore. He was standing next to the open van doors, gesturing for me to come closer. I started backing toward my car while pulling my phone out of my pocket. I told him I was calling security if he didn't return my groceries immediately. That seemed to change his whole demeanor, and the friendly mask completely dropped. "Don't be like that," he said, and his voice was different now, sharper and more aggressive. "I'm just trying to help you out here. The least you could do is be polite about it." I had my phone in my hand and was ready to dial 911 when I heard someone call out, "Everything okay over here?" I turned and saw this older man walking toward us from across the parking lot. He looked like he was probably in his 60s, carrying his own groceries, but he had noticed something was wrong and was coming to check. The guy with the van immediately slammed the doors shut and said loudly, "Yeah, everything's fine. Just helping the lady with her bags." But he was already moving away from the van and toward the driver's seat. The older man, who had come to help, looked back and forth between us and said, "Are those your groceries in his van?" When I said yes, he called out to the van guy, "Hey, hold on a minute. You need to give her those bags back." But the van guy was already getting into his vehicle. He started the engine and drove off quickly, taking about 5 bags of my groceries with him. I was left standing there with the older man who had tried to help, both of us staring after the van as it disappeared out of the parking lot. The man who had helped me said he was going to call the police, which he did right there in the parking lot. When the officers arrived, they took a report and looked at the security camera footage from the store. But the van didn't have a visible license plate, and the guy had been wearing a baseball cap that obscured most of his face. What really bothered me afterward was thinking about what would have happened if that older man hadn't come along when he did. The van guy had my groceries and was clearly trying to get me to come closer to his vehicle. If I had been alone for a few more minutes, would he have escalated the situation? The police told me this was probably someone who hangs around grocery store parking lots looking for women shopping alone, especially women with a lot of bags who might seem like they could use help. They said he was likely hoping I would get close enough to the van that he could grab me and push me inside. I've changed my shopping routine since then. I go during busier times when there are more people around, and I park closer to the store entrance, even if it means waiting for a spot. I also make sure to stay alert when I'm loading groceries, because I realise now how focused I get on that task and how easy it would be for someone to approach without me noticing. The whole thing made me think about how predators use our social conditioning against us. We're taught to be polite when strangers offer help, and he was counting on that politeness to get me close to his van. If I had been ruder from the beginning and told him to back off immediately, maybe he would have moved on to an easier target. That story is over. The grocery bag trick is absolutely diabolical because it forces you to either abandon your property or follow a stranger to their vehicle. This guy had clearly done this before and knew exactly how to manipulate social expectations around politeness. Thank goodness for that older man who trusted his instincts and intervened when something looked wrong. Here's our next story about an encounter that proves sometimes strangers know more about you than they should. The Stranger Who Knew My Name, posted by Hannah. I was 22 at the time and had just moved to a new city for my first job out of college. I didn't know many people yet, so I spent a lot of my free time exploring different neighbourhoods and parks, just trying to get familiar. with the area. There's this park about 10 minutes from my apartment that I really loved because it had these great walking trails and a small pond with ducks. I'd go there on weekend mornings to jog or just sit on a bench and read. It was usually pretty quiet, which I liked because it felt peaceful and I could think. Last month, I was sitting on my favourite bench reading a book when I noticed this man walking toward me on the path. He looked to be in his 30s, average height, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, nothing particularly memorable about him, just a regular guy out for a walk in the park. As he got closer, he smiled and waved like he knew me. I smiled back politely, thinking maybe he was just being friendly, but I didn't recognise him at all. I figured he was one of those people who waves at everyone they pass on walking trails. But instead of continuing past me, like I expected, he walked right up to my bench and said, "Hi, Hannah. How are you settling into the neighbourhood?" I was completely shocked because I had no idea who this person was, but he knew my name. I sat there for a moment just staring at him, trying to figure out if I had met him somewhere and forgotten. Maybe he was a co-worker or someone from my apartment building that I just wasn't recognising out of context. I said hi back and asked how he knew my name, hoping he would explain where we had met before. But his answer made my blood run cold. "Oh, I've been watching you come here for weeks," he said, still smiling, like this was a perfectly normal thing to say. "You're here every Saturday morning around the same time, usually reading on this same bench." I asked him how he knew my name if we had never actually met, and he said, "I heard someone call you Hannah at the coffee shop last week. You were with that blonde girl talking about your new job." Now I was really freaked out because I remembered that conversation. I'd been at a coffee shop near my office with a co-worker, and we were talking about how I was adjusting to the new job and the new city. But I had no memory of seeing this man there, which meant he must have been deliberately listening to our conversation without making himself known. I told him I didn't remember meeting him and asked what his name was. Instead of answering, he sat down on the bench next to me without being invited. The bench wasn't that long, so now he was sitting close enough that "Our a lot about you, Hannah," he said, and legs were almost touching. I know the way he said my name made me incredibly uncomfortable. "I know you work at the marketing firm downtown. I know you live in those apartments on Maple Street. I know you like to come here to read on Saturday mornings." I was trying not to panic, but this was clearly someone who had been following me and gathering information about my routine. The fact that he knew where I worked and lived meant this went way beyond just noticing me at the park a few times. I stood up and said I had to go, but he reached out and grabbed my wrist to stop me from walking away. His grip wasn't painful, but it was firm enough that I couldn't easily pull free. "Don't leave yet," he said. "I've been waiting to talk to you for weeks. I think we could be really good friends." I yanked my arm away and told him not to touch me, but he just laughed like I was being silly. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Hannah. I just want to get to know you better. You seem lonely, and I could help with that." The comment about me seeming lonely really bothered me because it suggested he had been watching me closely enough to make judgments about my emotional state. How long had he been observing me? What else did he think he knew about my life? I started walking away quickly, but I could hear him following behind me. He was calling out things like, "Come on, Hannah, don't be rude, and I know you walk back toward Maple Street. I'll walk with you." The fact that he knew my route home terrified me because it meant he had probably followed me before. I realised I needed to get somewhere public with other people around. So instead of heading toward my apartment, I walked toward the main road where there was a busy shopping centre. As soon as I got to the parking lot with other people around, I turned to see if he was still following me. He had stopped at the edge of the park and was just standing there watching me walk away. He didn't follow me into the shopping centre, but I could see him standing there for several more minutes before he finally left. I called my co-worker, who had been with me at the coffee shop, and told her what happened. She was really shaken up too, because it meant this guy had been close enough to overhear our personal conversation without either of us noticing. We tried to remember if we'd seen him that day, but neither of us could recall him being there. I reported the incident to the police, but They said without him actually threatening me or committing a crime, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I vary my routine and avoid going to that park alone for a while, which is exactly what I've been doing. It's been 3 weeks since that happened, and I haven't been back to the park at all. I really miss having that peaceful place to go on weekend mornings, but I'm too scared that he might be waiting there for me. The whole thing has made me much more aware of who's around me when I'm out in public, and I find myself constantly checking over my shoulder. What scares me most is wondering how much more he knows about me that he didn't mention. If he knows where I work and live, and he's been following my routine for weeks, what other information has he gathered? Does he know what time I leave for work? Does he know which grocery store I go to? I've started taking different routes to and from work, and I've been doing my shopping at different places just in case he's still watching. It's exhausting to feel like you have to constantly change your routine because someone might be following you. That story is over. The level of surveillance this guy had done is absolutely terrifying. Knowing her name, her workplace, her address, and her weekly routine means he'd been stalking her for weeks without her knowledge. The casual way he revealed all this information shows he thought it was completely normal behaviour. Hannah was right to trust her instincts and get to a public place immediately. Let's move on to our next story, which shows why picking up hitchhikers can be more dangerous than you might expect. The Hitchhiker on the Country Road, posted by Liam. This happened about 2 years ago when I was driving back from visiting my parents, who live in a pretty rural area. It's about a 3-hour drive on mostly back roads, and there's long stretches where you don't see much traffic or many houses. I was about halfway home, driving through this area that's basically just farmland and forest, when I saw a guy standing on the side of the road with his thumb out. He looked like he was maybe in his 20s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, carrying a small backpack. Nothing about him seemed particularly threatening at first glance. I normally don't pick up hitchhikers because my parents always warned me about it, but it was starting to get dark and we were in the middle of nowhere. I felt bad thinking about him being stuck out there all night, so I pulled over and rolled down my window to ask where he was headed. He said he was trying to get to the next town over, which was about 40 minutes in the direction I was already going. He seemed polite and grateful when I offered him a ride, so I unlocked the doors and he got in the passenger seat. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. He thanked me for stopping and we made small talk about the weather and how long he'd been waiting for a ride. He said his car had broken down earlier and he was trying to get home to his girlfriend. But as we continued driving, his questions started getting more personal and specific. He asked where I was coming from, where I lived, whether I lived alone, what I did for work. At first I answered because it seemed like normal conversation, but then I realised he was gathering a lot of information about me very quickly. When I asked him questions back, like what he did for work or where exactly he lived, his answers were vague and kept changing. First he said he worked construction. Then later he mentioned working at a restaurant. He said he lived with his girlfriend, but then talked about his roommate, and the details didn't add up. About 20 minutes into the ride, he started doing this thing where he would put his hand on my shoulder while he was talking. The first time I thought maybe it was just a casual gesture, but he kept doing it, and his grip would get tighter each time. It felt possessive and controlling, like he was testing how I would react. I asked him to keep his hands to himself, but he just laughed and said I was being uptight. "We're friends now," he said. "Friends can touch each other." But the way he said it made it clear that he didn't consider my comfort or boundaries to be important. The next time he grabbed my shoulder, he squeezed hard enough that it actually hurt. I told him to stop and tried to shrug his hand off, but he held on tighter. "Just relax," he said. "You're making this weird when it doesn't have to be." That's when I started to realise I might be in real danger. We were in the middle of nowhere. It was getting dark, and I had a stranger in my car who wasn't respecting basic boundaries and was getting increasingly aggressive. I started looking for somewhere I could pull over safely and get him out of my car, but as if he could read my mind, he said, "You know, I've changed my mind about where I want to go. Why don't you just keep driving for a while? I'm enjoying our conversation." His hand was still gripping my shoulder, and now his voice had this threatening edge to it. I told him I needed to stick to the original plan and drop him off in the next town like we had agreed. But he said, "I don't think that's going to work for me anymore. I think we should go somewhere more private where we can really get to know each other." My heart was racing because it was becoming clear that this wasn't just about getting a ride anymore. He had some other plan that he was now revealing piece by piece. I started thinking about what I could do if he tried to grab the steering wheel or attack me while I was driving. I saw a gas station coming up ahead, which was the first sign of civilization we'd seen in miles. I told him I needed to stop for gas, hoping I could get help, or at least get him out of my car in a public place. But he said, "No, keep driving, we don't need gas." When I started to slow down anyway, his grip on my shoulder became painful, and he said, "I said keep driving, don't make me tell you again." That's when I made a split-second decision. I yanked the wheel hard to the right and pulled into the gas station parking lot, slamming on the brakes as soon as we were stopped. Before he could react, I was out of the car and running toward the building, shouting for help. The hitchhiker got out of my car too, but instead of following me, he grabbed his backpack and took off running into the woods behind the gas station. By the time I got inside and explained to the attendant what was happening, he was completely gone. I called the police from the gas station, and they came out to take a report. They said I had done the right thing by getting to a public place and getting out of the car immediately. They also told me that they'd had reports of other incidents in that area involving someone matching his description, trying to get rides from lone drivers. The police drove me back to my car and followed me for about 10 miles to make sure I got safely back on the main highway. They said they'd increase patrols in that area, but they didn't think they'd be able to find the guy since he'd disappeared into the forest. I've never picked up a hitchhiker since then, and I probably never will again. The whole experience taught me that sometimes people asking for help aren't actually in distress. They're looking for opportunities to target someone who's trying to be kind. The isolation of that rural road made me realize how vulnerable you can be when you're alone in a car with a stranger. What bothers me most is thinking about what his real plan was. Where did he want me to drive to when he said somewhere more private? What was he planning to do once we got there? I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and got out of that situation before I found out. That story is over. The escalating physical contact and the sudden change in destination are classic predator tactics. He was testing Liam's boundaries and gradually revealing his real intentions once he thought he had control of the situation. The fact that police had other reports about someone matching his description means this was probably his regular method of finding victims. Sometimes being helpful can put you in serious danger. Our next story comes from someone who thought they were getting into a legitimate rideshare, but quickly realised something was very wrong. The time my Uber driver locked the doors, posted by Anonymous. I was visiting a friend in another city and had been out pretty late at some bars downtown. It was around 1 a.m. when I decided to call it a night and head back to my friend's apartment. I was staying about 15 minutes away, so I opened the Uber app and requested a ride. The car that showed up matched the description in the app, a dark sedan with the right license plate number. The driver looked like the photo too, so I got in the back seat like normal. He confirmed my name and the destination address, and we started driving. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The driver was quiet, which I didn't mind since I was tired and just wanted to get back to my friend's place. I was scrolling through my phone and not paying much attention to the route we were taking. But after about 5 minutes, I realised we weren't going in the right direction. I looked up from my phone and noticed we were heading away from the area where my friend lived, toward a part of the city I wasn't familiar with. I asked the driver if he was taking a different route because of traffic or construction, but he didn't answer me. He just kept driving in the wrong direction. I could see his eyes watching me in the rearview mirror, but he wouldn't respond when I spoke to him. I pulled up the Uber app on my phone to check the route, and according to the GPS, we should have been going completely the opposite direction. I told the driver that the app was showing a different way to go, but he still didn't say anything. That's when I started to get nervous and asked him to please turn around and take me to the correct address. Instead of responding or changing direction, I heard the sound of the car doors locking. All 4 doors locked simultaneously with that electronic clicking sound. I immediately tried to open my door, but the handle wouldn't work. The child safety locks must have been activated, so I couldn't get out, even though I was pulling on the handle. I was trapped in the back seat while this guy continued driving in the wrong direction. I raised my voice and demanded that he unlock the doors and take me to my destination immediately. That's when he finally spoke, and what he said made my blood run cold. "Change of plans," he said, looking at me in the mirror. "We're going somewhere else first." I told him I wanted to get out of the car right now, and if he didn't stop and unlock the doors, I was going to call the police. He just laughed and said, "Go ahead and try. See how that works out for you." I did try to call 911, but my phone wasn't getting a signal. I don't know if we were in a dead zone or if he had some kind of signal blocker, but I couldn't make any calls. I was completely cut off from any way to get help. We had been driving for about 15 minutes at this point, and we were now in an area I didn't recognize at all. It looked like we were heading towards some kind of industrial district with warehouses and empty lots. There were no other cars around and no signs of people or businesses. I was starting to panic because I realized this wasn't just a case of a confused driver or a GPS error. This person had deliberately locked me in his car and was taking me somewhere isolated. I started thinking about what I could use as a weapon if I needed to defend myself. That's when I remembered I had a small pocket knife on my keychain. It wasn't very big, but it was sharp enough to cut things. I quietly got it out and held it in my hand, ready to use it if he tried to hurt me. I also started looking around the car for other things I could use. There was a water bottle I could throw, and I thought maybe I could break a window with my shoe if I had to. I was trying to prepare for whatever was going to happen when we reached wherever he was taking me, but then something unexpected happened. We came to a red light at an intersection, and there was another car stopped next to us. I immediately started banging on the window and screaming for help, hoping the people in the other car would see me and realize something was wrong. The driver of the other car was a woman, and she could clearly see me hitting the window and yelling. She rolled down her window and asked if I was okay. I shouted that I was being kidnapped and needed help. That's when my Uber driver suddenly unlocked the doors and told me to get out. He was acting like I was crazy, and he was just an innocent driver trying to do his job. But the woman in the other car had already called 911, and I could hear sirens in the distance. I jumped out of the car as fast as I could and ran to the other vehicle. The woman let me get in her car while we waited for the police to arrive, but by the time they got there, the fake Uber driver had taken off. The police took a report and looked into it, but it turned out the car wasn't actually registered with Uber. The license plate was fake, and the driver's profile in the app had been created with stolen information. It was someone posing as a legitimate rideshare driver to target people who were alone and vulnerable, and the police said this was becoming a more common scam, especially late at night when people are coming out of bars and might not be paying close attention to details. They said I should always verify that the license plate, car model, and driver photo match exactly before getting into any rideshare vehicle. I never found out what would have happened if that other driver hadn't been at that intersection, but I'm grateful I didn't have to find out. The whole experience made me much more cautious about rideshares, especially when I'm in an unfamiliar city or travelling alone at night. I now always take a photo of the license plate and send it to a friend before I get in any rideshare car. I also check that the child's safety locks aren't activated. I also make sure to sit in the back seat and keep the ride details visible on my phone so I can track the route in real time. It's sad that you have to be so paranoid about something that's supposed to be a safe way to get around, but predators are always finding new ways to exploit systems people trust. That story is over. The fake rideshare scam is absolutely terrifying because it exploits our trust in technology and legitimate services. The fact that he had locked doors ready to go and drove straight toward an isolated area shows this was a planned operation, not a spontaneous crime. Thank goodness for that other driver who didn't ignore someone clearly in distress. Let's move on to our next story, which takes place in what should have been a safe, quiet environment. The creepy old man at the library. Posted by OP, I'm a college student, and I spend a lot of time at the public library studying, especially during finals week when the campus library gets too crowded and noisy. There's this really nice, quiet section upstairs with individual study tables where I can spread out all my books and notes. Last month I was there on a Tuesday afternoon working on a research paper that was due the next day. It was around 3 p.m, so the library wasn't very busy. Most people were at work or school, and the upstairs study area was almost completely empty, which was perfect for me since I needed to concentrate. I had been there for about an hour when this older man came upstairs and started walking around the study area. He looked to be maybe in his 60s or 70s, wearing a cardigan sweater and carrying a newspaper. At first, I figured he was just looking for a quiet place to read. There were probably 20 empty tables and chairs available in that section, but instead of choosing one of the many empty spots, he sat down at the table directly next to mine. Like right next to me, even though there was literally no one else around and he could have sat anywhere. I thought it was a little weird, but maybe he preferred that particular spot for some reason. I tried to ignore him and keep working on my paper, but I could feel him looking at me out of the corner of my eye. Every time I'd glance over, he'd quickly look down at his newspaper like he'd been reading the whole time. After about 15 minutes of this, he scooted his chair closer to my table. Now he was close enough that I could smell his cologne, which was way too strong and made me feel a little nauseous. I moved my books and papers more toward my side of the table to create some distance, but he just moved closer again. That's when he started trying to start a conversation. He said something about how nice it was to see young people studying so hard and asked what I was working on. I gave him a brief answer about my research paper, hoping he would take the hint that I was busy and needed to concentrate. But instead of leaving me alone, he kept talking. He started making comments about my appearance, saying things like how pretty my hair looked and how nice my sweater was. The way he said it felt creepy and inappropriate, not like casual compliments from a friendly older person. Then he said something that made me really uncomfortable. "You're such a pretty girl. I bet you have lots of boyfriends." The way he said it and the way he was looking at me made my skin crawl. This wasn't normal conversation between strangers in a library. I told him I really needed to focus on my work and couldn't talk anymore. I thought that would be a clear enough signal for him to leave me alone, but he actually seemed to take it as encouragement to move even closer. He leaned in towards me and lowered his voice to almost a whisper. "I come here every Tuesday and Thursday," he said. "Always around this time. It gets lonely, you know. It's nice to have someone pretty to talk to." The whispering made everything feel more threatening somehow. We were alone in that section of the library, and now he was talking quietly, like he didn't want anyone else to hear our conversation. I started thinking about how isolated we were up there, and how no one would be able to see if something happened. I decided I needed to pack up my things and move somewhere else in the library where there were more people around. But as I started putting my books in my bag, he put his hand on my arm to stop me. "Don't leave yet," he whispered. "I was hoping we could be friends. I know lots of things that might help with your studies. I used to be a professor, you know." I pulled my arm away and told him not to touch me, but he just smiled like I was being silly. "I'm not trying to hurt you, dear. I just think we could help each other out. I could give you advice about your schoolwork, and you could keep an old man company." The way he said, "help each other out," made it clear he wasn't just talking about academic advice. There was definitely an implied quid pro quo that had nothing to do with studying. I felt sick thinking about what he was suggesting. I stood up quickly and grabbed my bag, telling him I had to go. But he stood up too and followed me as I walked toward the stairs. He was saying things like, "Think about it, dear. I'll be here Thursday if you change your mind." I practically ran down the stairs and went straight to the front desk to talk to one of the librarians. I explained what had happened and pointed out the man who had followed me downstairs and was now pretending to browse books near the reference section. The librarian was really understanding and said they'd had problems with this particular man before. Apparently, he had been approaching young women in the library and making them uncomfortable for months. She said they'd spoken to him about it several times, but he kept coming back. She called security and they escorted him out of the building. They also told him he wasn't welcome back, but the librarian warned me that he might try to come back anyway, since they'd had to ban him before, and he'd still shown up. I ended up finishing my paper at home that day because I was too shaken up to concentrate. I've been back to the library since then, but I always make sure to sit somewhere with lots of people around, and I keep an eye out for that man in case he does come back. What bothers me most is that he clearly had a pattern of targeting young women who were alone and studying. The librarian's reaction made it clear this wasn't his first time doing this, which means there are probably other students who've had similar experiences with him. I also keep thinking about his comment about being there every Tuesday and Thursday. That sounds like he was casing the library regularly, looking for opportunities to approach women who fit whatever profile he was looking for. The fact that he specifically mentioned those days makes me think he'd been watching me and knew my study schedule. That story is over. The systematic nature of his approach and the fact that the library staff already knew about him shows this was predatory behaviour, not just an awkward, lonely old man. Using the guise of being a former professor to offer help with schoolwork was clearly his way of trying to establish some kind of ongoing relationship. Libraries should be safe spaces for students, and it's disturbing that he was allowed to keep coming back after multiple complaints. Our next story involves a late-night encounter that started with someone asking for help, but quickly became something much more sinister. The woman who knocked on my door at midnight, posted by Sophia. I live alone in a small apartment complex in a pretty safe neighbourhood. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbours and look out for each other, so I generally feel secure there. My apartment is on the second floor, and you have to buzz in through the main entrance to get into the building. About 3 weeks ago, I was woken up around midnight by someone knocking on my apartment door. Not gentle knocking like someone who was worried about waking people up, but loud, persistent banging that was impossible to ignore. I figured it must be some kind of emergency, maybe a neighbour who needed help, or a fire alarm malfunction. I got out of bed and put on a robe, but before opening the door, I looked through the peephole to see who it was. There was a woman standing in the hallway who I'd never seen before. She looked like she was maybe in her 30s, with long brown hair and wearing jeans and a t-shirt. What struck me as odd right away was her expression. She wasn't crying or looking panicked like someone who was having an emergency. She was just standing there with this weird smile on her face, staring directly at my door like she knew I was looking at her through the peephole. I called out and asked what she needed, hoping I could help without actually opening the door. She said her name was Jennifer and that she lived in the building, and she needed to use my phone because hers had died and she was locked out of her apartment. Her story seemed reasonable enough, but something about the situation felt wrong. First of all, I knew most of the people in my building, at least by sight, and I'd never seen this woman before. Second, if she lived here, how did she get into the building without being buzzed in? The main entrance locks automatically after 9 p.m. I told her I could call someone for her if she gave me the number, but I wasn't comfortable opening my door to a stranger in the middle of the night. That's when her whole demeanour changed. The smile disappeared and she started banging on the door again, harder this time. "Just open the door," she said, and her voice was different now, less friendly, more demanding. "I know you're in there. I can see the light under your door." I looked through the peephole again, and she was standing even closer to the door now, still staring directly at where the peephole was. It was like she was trying to make eye contact with me through the tiny opening, which was impossible, but still really unsettling. I told her I wasn't going to open the door, but I could call the building manager or the police if she needed help getting into her apartment. She laughed, and it was not a normal laugh. It was this high-pitched, almost manic sound that made my skin crawl. "I don't need help getting into my apartment," she said. "I need to get into yours." That statement made it crystal clear that this wasn't someone who was locked out or having an emergency. This was someone who specifically wanted to get into my apartment for reasons that definitely weren't good. I told her I was calling the police and she needed to leave, but instead of leaving, she started trying different tactics. First, she went back to the fake friendly voice and said she was sorry if she'd scared me, that she was just having a really bad night and needed someone to talk to. She said she'd seen my lights on and thought maybe I was awake and wouldn't mind helping a neighbour. When that didn't work, she tried guilt trips. She said she was new to the building and didn't know anyone, that she was going through a divorce and felt really alone. She claimed she just needed someone to listen to her for a few minutes. And then she'd leave. I wasn't buying any of it, especially since her story kept changing. First, she was locked out. Then she needed to use a phone. Then she just wanted someone to talk to. None of it was consistent. And the way she'd gone from smiling to demanding to pleading all within a few minutes showed she was trying different approaches to manipulate me. I called 911 while she was still talking through the door, and I could hear her voice getting more agitated as she realised I wasn't going to let her in. She started saying things like, "You can't hide in there forever, and I know where you live now." The police arrived about 10 minutes later, but by the time they got to my floor, she was gone. They checked the hallway and the stairwells, but there was no sign of her anywhere. They took a report and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but without knowing who she was or where she went, there wasn't much else they could do. What really bothered me was that the officers confirmed she shouldn't have been able to get into the building without being buzzed in by a resident. Either someone had let her in, or she had found another way to get inside. They checked the building's entrances and everything seemed secure, so it was a mystery how she'd gotten access. The building manager reviewed the security camera footage the next day, but the cameras don't cover the hallway outside my apartment, just the main entrance and exits. They could see her entering the building around 11:30 p.m, but the angle didn't show her face clearly, and they couldn't tell if someone had buzzed her in or if she'd gotten in some other way. I've been really paranoid since then about who I buzz into the building, and I always check the peephole before opening my door, even during the day. I also got a security camera for my front door and a deadbolt lock that can only be opened from the inside. The most unsettling part is that I still don't know what she actually wanted. Her changing story suggests she was making things up as she went along, but her determination to get into my apartment specifically was really concerning. Why my door? Why that night? Had she been watching my building or targeting me for some reason? I haven't seen her since then, but I keep wondering if she'll come back. The building management says they've tightened security, but I can't shake the feeling that someone who is that determined won't just give up after one attempt. That story is over. The calculated way she tried different manipulation tactics shows this wasn't some confused person having a crisis. This was someone who came prepared with multiple strategies to get inside, and the fact that she specifically said she needed to get into Sophia's apartment rather than just any help is deeply disturbing. Thank goodness Sophia trusted her instincts and kept that door locked. Let's move to our next story, which involves an encounter during what should have been a peaceful morning jog. The jogger who chased me, posted by Noah. I've been running the same route through my neighbourhood for about 3 years now. It's a nice loop that takes me through some residential streets and then around this small park before heading back home. I usually go early in the morning around 6 a.m. when there's not much traffic and the air is still cool. Last Thursday started like any other running day. I was about 15 minutes into my usual route, running through the park section, when I noticed another jogger behind me. At first I didn't think much of it since lots of people use that park for exercise, especially in the morning. But as I continued running, I realised this person was staying exactly the same distance behind me. Not catching up, not falling back, just maintaining this perfect gap of maybe 20 feet. I tested it by speeding up slightly, And sure enough, they sped up too. When I slowed down, they slowed down. I turned around to get a better look at who was following me. It was a guy who looked to be in his 30s, wearing dark running clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't wave or acknowledge me when I looked back, just kept running at that same measured pace. I figured maybe we just happened to be going in the same direction, and he was using me as a pacing guide, which runners sometimes do. So I continued on my normal route, thinking he'd probably branch off somewhere else soon. But when I left the park and turned onto the residential street that leads toward my neighbourhood, he turned too. And when I made the next turn that takes me closer to my house, he followed again. This wasn't coincidental anymore. He was deliberately following my exact route. I started to get nervous because my route is pretty specific to where I live. It's not like following someone on a main road that lots of people use. These were turns that only made sense if you were going to my particular area of the neighbourhood. I decided to test whether he was actually following me or just happened to live in the same direction. Instead of taking my final turn toward home, I kept going straight for 2 more blocks, which would take me away from my house and toward a different part of town. He followed. Even though continuing straight didn't make sense for someone who actually lived in this area and was just finishing their own run, he stayed right behind me at that same distance. Now I was really scared because it was becoming obvious that this person was tracking me specifically, not just running in the same general direction. I was also starting to worry about leading him closer to where I lived, since my normal route would take me right to my front door. I pulled out my phone and pretended to take a call, hoping that if he heard me talking to someone, he might back off. I spoke loudly enough for him to hear me say things like, "Yeah, I'm almost done with my run, and I'll see you in a few minutes," trying to make it sound like someone was expecting me. But he didn't change his behaviour at all. He just kept following at that same steady pace. Like my fake phone call meant nothing to him. I was running out of ideas for how to lose him without leading him directly to my house. Then I remembered there's a police station about 6 blocks from where we were. I decided to head there instead of going home, figuring that if this guy had bad intentions, he probably wouldn't want to follow me to a place full of cops. I changed direction and started jogging toward the police station. For the first few blocks, he continued following me, but as we got closer to the station, I noticed he was starting to fall back a little. When I was about a block away from the police building, I turned around and saw that he had stopped running entirely. He was just standing on the sidewalk watching me, no longer even pretending to be out for a jog. He stood there for maybe 2 minutes, staring in the direction of the police station, then turned around and walked away quickly in the opposite direction. I went into the police station and reported what had happened. The officer I spoke with said they'd had a few similar reports in recent weeks about someone following joggers in that area. He took down my description of the guy and said they'd increase patrols during morning exercise hours. The officer also gave me some advice about varying my running route and time, so I wouldn't be predictable if this person was targeting runners regularly. He said predators often look for people who have consistent patterns that make them easy to track. I haven't been back to that park since then, which really bothers me because it was my favourite part of my running route. I've been using a completely different path through a busier part of town where there are more people around, but it's not as peaceful as my old route. The whole experience made me realise how vulnerable runners can be, especially when we're alone and focused on our exercise. We're often in our own zone with headphones, or just concentrating on our pace, and we might not notice someone following us until it's been going on for a while. I keep wondering what would have happened if I had led him back to my house like I normally would have. Would he have just noted where I lived and moved on, or did he have some more immediate plan? The fact that he gave up as soon as I headed toward the police station suggests he definitely didn't want law enforcement involved. That story is over. The precision of his following and the way he immediately retreated when Noah headed toward police shows this was predatory stalking, not coincidental exercise timing. The fact that police had multiple reports about someone targeting joggers in that area means this guy was probably doing this regularly, studying people's routines and looking for opportunities. Noah's decision to go to the police station probably saved him from finding out what this person's real intentions were. Our next story comes from someone who encountered a fake authority figure in a very public place. The mall security guard who wasn't real. Posted by OP. I was at the mall last weekend doing some shopping for my sister's birthday. It was a Saturday afternoon, so the place was pretty busy with families and teenagers hanging out. I had just finished buying something at one of the department stores and was walking through the main corridor when this guy approached me. He was wearing what looked like a security uniform, complete with a badge and a radio clipped to his belt. He looked official enough at first glance, maybe in his 40s with short grey hair and the kind of serious expression you'd expect from mall security. He walked up to me and said there had been reports of someone matching my description, shoplifting from one of the stores. He said he needed to search my bags and escort me to the security office to sort everything out. I was completely shocked. I figured there must be some misunderstanding because I obviously hadn't stolen anything, but could be cleared up easily. I started to follow him like he asked, but something about the situation felt off. First, he seemed nervous in a way that didn't match his authoritative tone. He kept looking around while he was talking to me, like he was worried about something. Second, when I asked which store had reported the theft, he gave me a vague answer about one of the retailers instead of being specific. As we walked toward what he said was the security office, I started paying more attention to his uniform and equipment. The badge looked wrong somehow, like it was made of cheap plastic instead of metal. And the radio on his belt wasn't making any of the crackling sounds or occasional chatter that you usually hear from real security radios. When we got to a less crowded area of the mall, he suddenly grabbed my arm and started trying to steer me toward a side exit instead of toward any kind of office. That's when I knew for certain that something was seriously wrong. I pulled my arm away and told him I wanted to see his identification and speak to another security guard to verify who he was. He got agitated and said there wasn't time for that we needed to handle this situation immediately before it became a bigger problem. I started backing away from him and looking around for real mall security or other people who could help. That's when I noticed his badge more clearly and realized it was obviously fake. It said security officer in generic letters, but it didn't have the mall's logo or any official identification numbers. I told him I wasn't going anywhere with him until I could verify he actually worked there. He started getting more aggressive, saying I was making things worse for myself by not cooperating, but I could see panic starting to show in his eyes as he realized his scam wasn't working. A family with kids walked past us and I called out to them for help. I explained loudly that this person was pretending to be security and trying to get me to leave with him. The father of the family immediately came over and asked to see the guy's credentials. The fake security guard realized he was caught and started backing away. He mumbled something about getting back up and walked quickly toward the nearest exit. The family stayed with me while I found the real mall security office and reported what had happened. The actual security guards were really concerned and said they'd had reports of someone impersonating security staff at other malls in the area. They said this person was probably trying to get people to come with him so he could rob them, or worse, once they were outside the mall. They showed me what real mall security badges and uniforms looked like, and the differences were obvious once you knew what to look for. The fake badge was just a cheap laminated card, and his uniform was missing several details that the real ones had. The security team reviewed their cameras and found footage of the fake guard approaching other shoppers earlier that day. They said he'd been there for several hours, walking around and observing people, probably looking for someone who seemed like an easy target. They called the police, but by the time officers arrived, the guy had left the mall entirely. They did get some good camera footage of his face though, and they said they'd share it with other malls in the area to warn their security teams. The real security guards told me I'd done exactly the right thing by asking questions and refusing to go with him. They said a lot of people would have just trusted the uniform and followed him, especially if they were nervous about being accused of shoplifting. What really bothers me is how convincing his act was initially. If you weren't paying close attention, you'd probably assume he was legitimate security doing his job. The uniform looked real from a distance, and he had the right kind of serious, authoritative manner. I keep thinking about how many people he might have approached before me, and whether anyone actually fell for his scam. The security guard said he'd been there for hours, which suggests he was being very systematic about selecting targets and waiting for the right opportunity. It's scary to think that someone can just put on a fake uniform and use people's natural tendency to trust authority figures to manipulate them into dangerous situations. Most of us are taught to cooperate with security guards and police officers, and predators know how to exploit that conditioning. That story's over. The fake authority angle is particularly insidious because most people are conditioned to comply with security personnel without questioning them. The fact that he was systematically working the mall for hours shows this was a well-planned operation, not some spur-of-the-moment scam. His immediate retreat when challenged proves he was counting on people not asking questions or demanding verification. Let's move on to our next story, which takes place in what should have been a safe public transportation setting. The creeper who sat beside me on the train, posted by Chloe. I take the commuter train to work every day, and it's usually a pretty routine 30-minute ride. The train has multiple cars with plenty of seating, especially during off-peak hours when I travel. Last Tuesday, I got on around 2 p.m. for the trip back home from a doctor's appointment. The car I chose was almost completely empty. There were maybe 3 other passengers scattered throughout, all sitting by themselves with plenty of space between them. I picked a seat near the middle of the car and settled in with a book I'd been reading. At the next stop, a man got on and looked around at all the available seating. The entire car was basically empty, with dozens of open seats to choose from. But instead of sitting anywhere else, he walked directly to my row and sat down right next to me. Not across from me, not a few seats away, but in the seat immediately next to mine, even though there was literally no reason for him to sit that close to anyone. The whole situation felt wrong immediately, because people don't normally choose to sit right next to strangers on public transit when there are other options available. He was maybe in his 50s, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and jeans. He had this strange smile on his face as he sat down, like he was pleased with himself for some reason. I tried to ignore him and keep reading my book, but I could feel him staring at me. After a few minutes, he started trying to make conversation. He commented on the book I was reading, even though he couldn't possibly see the title from his angle. He asked where I was headed and whether I took this train regularly. The questions felt like he was gathering information about my routine. I gave him brief, polite answers, but tried to make it clear I wanted to read and not chat. I even held my book up higher to create a barrier between us, but he didn't take the hint. Instead, he leaned closer and started speaking in a whisper. "You have really nice hair," he said quietly, and I could feel his breath on my ear. The way he said it made my skin crawl because it wasn't a casual compliment. It was intimate and inappropriate, especially from a complete stranger. I shifted away from him toward the window, but he just scooted closer to maintain the same uncomfortable proximity. Now his leg was touching mine, and when I tried to move away, he moved with me, like we were connected somehow. He continued whispering comments about my appearance, saying things about my clothes and asking if I had a boyfriend. Each whisper felt more invasive than the last, and the fact that he was speaking so quietly made it feel secretive and threatening. I told him I wasn't interested in talking and asked him to please give me some space. But he acted like I hadn't said anything and kept making his creepy observations. He said something about how young women these days didn't know how to appreciate older men who could take care of them. That comment made it clear that this wasn't just awkward social behaviour. This was someone who had specific ideas about what he wanted from this interaction, and my comfort, obviously, wasn't part of his consideration. I looked around the car to see if there were other passengers who might help if I needed it, but the few people who'd been there earlier had gotten off at previous stops. Now it was just me and this guy, and we still had about 15 minutes left before reaching my stop. I decided I needed to move to a different seat, so I stood up and walked to the complete opposite end of the car. There were plenty of empty rows there, so I chose one and sat down, hoping he would take the hint and leave me alone. But he got up and followed me. Again, he sat down right next to me instead of giving me space. Now I was really scared because his behaviour was escalating and becoming more obviously predatory. He wasn't just being inappropriate, he was actively pursuing me despite my clear attempts to get away from him. "Why are you running away from me?" he whispered. "I'm just trying to be friendly. Don't you like making new friends?" The way he phrased it made me feel like he was trying to make me seem rude or antisocial for not wanting to engage with him. But there was nothing friendly about his behaviour, and I wasn't going to let him guilt-trip me into tolerating harassment. I stood up again and walked to the very front of the car, near the conductor's area, where there was an emergency call button. I was hoping the proximity to official train staff might discourage him from continuing to bother me. This time, he didn't immediately follow, but I could see him watching me from across the car. He stayed in his seat, but kept staring and occasionally making gestures, like he was trying to get my attention. Every time I looked in his direction, he'd smile and wave like nothing inappropriate had happened. When we finally reached my stop, I waited until the doors opened and then quickly got off the train. I looked back and saw that he had gotten up and was moving toward the doors too, like he might be planning to follow me off the train. I immediately walked to the station security office and reported what had happened. They said they'd review camera footage from the train car and try to identify the man. They also gave me information about which car the conductor usually rides in, so I could sit near staff on future trips. The security officer told me this kind of thing happens more often than people realise, especially on less crowded trains, where predators know they can corner someone without witnesses. He said I'd done the right thing by moving away and coming to report it. I've been taking earlier trains since then, when there are more commuters around and less chance of being alone with someone like that. It's frustrating that I had to change my schedule because of one creepy person, but I'd rather be safe than risk another encounter. That was definitely a story. Honestly, if I had that happen to me, I would be taking less trains as well. This next story comes from someone who discovered that their daily routine had attracted some very unwanted attention. The man who waited outside my work. Every night, I work at a small retail store in downtown Portland, and my shifts usually end around 9 p.m. when we close. The store is located on a busy street during the day, but it gets pretty quiet after dark, with most of the foot traffic being people heading to bars or restaurants a few blocks over. About 3 months ago, I started noticing this man who would be standing outside when I left work. At first, I didn't think much of it because there are bus stops nearby and people wait around for different reasons. But after seeing him there several nights in a row, always in the same spot, I began to pay more attention. He was probably in his 40s, average height, wearing a dark jacket and jeans most nights. What made me uncomfortable was that he wasn't waiting for a bus or looking at his phone like most people do. He was just standing there under the lamppost across from our store entrance, and every time I came out, he would be looking directly at me. The first few times I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe he worked nearby and was waiting for a ride. Maybe he was meeting someone. But as weeks went by, the pattern became undeniable. Every single night I worked, he was there. Same spot, same staring. I started varying my routine to test my suspicions. Some nights I'd leave through the back employee exit instead of the front door. Those nights I wouldn't see him at all. But if I left through the front, there he was, without fail. He'd watch me walk to my car, and I could feel his eyes on me the entire time until I drove away. The situation escalated about a month ago. I was closing alone, which happens sometimes when we're understaffed. As I locked up the front door, I saw him in his usual spot, but this time he started walking toward me, instead of just watching. My heart immediately started racing, and I quickly got to my car and locked the doors. He stopped about 10 feet away from my car and just stood there, staring at me through the windshield. I sat there for what felt like forever, not wanting to get out if he was going to approach me, but also not wanting to just sit there like a sitting duck. Finally, I started the engine and backed out quickly. That's when I noticed he had his own car parked nearby. As I drove away, I saw headlights pull out behind me. I took several random turns to see if he would follow, and sure enough, he stayed behind me for about 6 blocks before finally turning off. I reported it to my manager the next day, and she said she'd keep an eye out and that I should call the police if I saw him again. She also started scheduling someone else to close with me when possible. But the thing is, he seemed to know when I was working alone versus when someone else was there, because he only appeared on nights when I left by myself. 2 weeks ago, I finally got a clear photo of him. I pretended to be texting while walking to my car, but I was actually taking pictures. The photos weren't great quality because of the lighting, but you could clearly see his face, and the fact that he was definitely watching me. I took the photos to the police and filed a report. The officer said that technically he wasn't doing anything illegal by standing on a public sidewalk, but that I should document everything and call immediately if he ever approached me or followed me home. He also suggested I vary my schedule and maybe have someone walk me to my car. The weird thing is, ever since I filed that police report, I haven't seen him in 2 weeks now. Part of me is relieved, but another part of me wonders if he's just gotten better at hiding or if he's moved on to following someone else. I still get nervous walking to my car after work, and I always check that spot under the lamppost. My manager installed a security camera that covers the front of the store, so at least now, if he comes back, we'll have better footage. I keep thinking about all those nights he was out there watching me, and it makes my skin crawl. How long had he been doing it before I noticed? Was he following other employees too? Did he know where I lived? The whole thing has made me realize how vulnerable we can be without even knowing it. I'm sharing this story because I want other people, especially women, to trust their instincts. If something feels off about someone's behavior, it probably is. Don't dismiss those uncomfortable feelings just because someone isn't technically breaking any laws. And if you're in a similar situation, document everything and report it. Even if the police can't arrest someone for standing on a sidewalk, having it on record could be important later. That story is absolutely chilling because it shows how someone can terrorize you without technically breaking any laws. The fact that this creep had clearly studied her schedule and knew exactly when she'd be alone is genuinely terrifying. Standing in the same spot night after night, just watching and waiting. Thank goodness she trusted her instincts and documented everything, because that level of calculated stalking behavior rarely just stops on its own. Our next story comes from someone who learned that even the supposed safety of a hotel room isn't always guaranteed. The stranger in the hotel hallway. I was traveling for work last year and staying at a budget motel off the interstate in rural Ohio. It was one of those places where you park right outside your room door, and all the rooms open directly to the outside rather than an interior hallway. Not the nicest place, but it was what my company booked, and I'd 8 p.m. after a long day of driving. I checked in around the room I was on, in the second floor, number 237, at the far end of the building. The parking lot was pretty empty, maybe 6 or 7 other cars scattered around. I grabbed my overnight bag and headed up to have. I ordered some takeout like that, clean enough but dated, with thin walls and that musty smell that all cheap motels. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a place took a shower, and settled in to watch TV and get some work done on my laptop. Around 11 p.m, I started hearing footsteps on the walkway outside my room. At first I didn't think anything a few minutes, then I realised the footsteps would move, what sounded like someone was obviously be coming and going, but after moving past my room, they were stopping right outside my door. I muted the TV and listened more away for a minute, then come back. I hear handles, the quiet metal clicking sound when you turn a knob. My heart started beating faster as I realised someone was going room to room, checking if doors were unlocked. I crept over to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. I could see a man in dark clothing moving along the walkway. He would approach each door, try the handle very quietly, and if it didn't open, he'd move to the next one. He wasn't trying to break in or making noise, just testing to see if anyone had left their door unlocked. I watched him work his way down the row of rooms toward mine. Room 233, locked. Room 234, locked. Room 235, locked. Room 236, right next to mine, locked. And then he was at my door. I held my breath as I heard my door handle turn slowly. Thank God I had engaged both the regular lock and the chain lock when I came in. The handle turned all the way, but the door didn't budge. He tried it again, applying a little more pressure, but the locks held. What happened next scared me more than anything. Instead of moving on like he had with the other locked doors, he stayed at my door. I could see his shadow under the gap at the bottom of the door, and I could hear him breathing on the other side. He just stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then I heard a very soft knock. Not a normal knock like someone looking for a specific person, but a quiet, tentative tapping, like he was testing to see if anyone was awake inside. I didn't make a sound or move from my position by the window. After another minute of silence, I saw his shadow move away from my door. I thought he was leaving, but when I looked out, Clark answered, and I whispered that someone was going the other side of mine and was trying that door handle too. Check it out, and asked me to stay on the line room to room trying door handles. He said he'd come the window again. He had moved to the room on. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk. The night clerk reached the walkway. I watched from my window as a man came to the second floor. By the time the out of the office area and started walking toward the stairs, stranger was gone. I didn't see where he went, but he had vanished. The clerk walked the entire length of the building, checking all the walkways and the parking lot, but found nothing. He came to my room, and I told him exactly what I'd seen. He said this had happened a few times over the past year, and they suspected it was someone looking for rooms where travellers might have left valuables visible or doors accidentally unlocked. He offered to move me to a different room closer to the office, but honestly, I was too shaken up to sleep anyway. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the chair by the window, checking the parking lot every few minutes. I kept my phone in my hand and had 911 ready to dial. Every sound in the hallway made me freeze and listen. Around 3 a.m, I heard footsteps again. Same slow, deliberate pace. I looked out and saw the same figure moving along the first floor walkway this time, going door to door with the same methodical approach. I called the front desk again, but by the time the clerk came out, the person had disappeared once more. I checked out first thing in the morning and drove straight home instead of continuing my business trip. I reported the incident to the police and to the motel chain's corporate office. The local police said they'd increase patrols in that area, and the corporate office said they'd follow up with the property management intact. That was 8 months ago, and I still get anxiety where rooms open directly outside. I always triple check my locks now, especially when staying in motels, and I never leave anything valuable visible from the windows. The thought that this person might have found an unlocked door that night, and what might have happened to whoever was inside, still gives me nightmares. That story gives me chills because it's so calculated and methodical. This wasn't some random drunk person stumbling around. This was someone who clearly had a system. It makes you wonder how many times he had done this before, how he was shopping for victims, and knowing that he came back later that same night shows this wasn't just opportunistic behaviour. The fact that he had a process, going door to door looking for unlocked doors, turned something as simple as a trip into something much more sinister. This happened to me about 6 months ago. I'm a college student, the guy who followed me into the bookstore. I was walking home from campus. It was around 4 p.m. on a Thursday, still plenty of daylight, and I was taking my usual route through downtown to get to my apartment. I first noticed him when I was about 3 blocks from campus. He was walking behind me, maybe 20 feet back, wearing a grey hoodie and jeans. At first I didn't think anything of it, because lots of people walk this route, and it's not unusual to end up walking in the same direction as other students or people getting off work. But after a couple blocks, I started to feel like something was off. I slowed down to see if he would pass me, but he slowed down too. When I sped up, he matched my pace. I took a left turn down a street that wasn't part of my usual route home, just to see what would happen. He turned left too. That's when I knew for sure he was following me. My heart started racing, and I tried to think of what to do. I didn't want to lead him to my apartment, but I also didn't want to be alone on some random street with him behind me. I remembered there was a bookstore called Pages and Pages, about half a block ahead. It's this cozy little independent bookstore that's usually busy with college students and locals browsing. I figured I could duck in there, maybe lose him in the aisles, or at least be around other people where I'd feel safer. I walked into the bookstore trying to act casual, like I'd been planning to stop there all along. The store has this layout where tall bookshelves create different sections, and you can't see the whole store from the entrance. I immediately headed toward the back, hoping he wouldn't follow me inside. But less than a minute later, I saw him come through the front door. He didn't look around like someone who was actually shopping for books. Instead, he seemed to be scanning the store, clearly looking for someone, looking for me. I was in the poetry section at the back of the store, pretending to browse while keeping an eye on him through the gaps between books on the shelves. He started walking through the aisles systematically, like he was hunting. Every time I moved to a different section, he would follow a few minutes later. I went to the fiction section. 2 minutes later, there he was, pretending to look at novels, but clearly watching me. I moved to the history section, same thing, travel guides, science books, even the children's section in the back corner. Wherever I went, he would appear shortly after, always with this fake browsing act, but never actually picking up a book or reading anything. The whole thing went on for about 20 minutes. That was 8 months ago, and I still get anxiety where rooms open directly outside. I always triple-check my locks now when staying in motels, and I never leave anything valuable visible from the windows. The thought that this person might have found an unlocked door that night, and what might have happened to whoever was inside, still gives me nightmares. That story gives me chills because it's so calculated and methodical. This wasn't some random drunk person stumbling around. This was someone who had clearly done this multiple times before, shopping for victims, and knowing that he had a system, going door to door and coming back later that same night, shows this wasn't just opportunistic behaviour. The fact that he came back makes you realise how a simple trip to a store can turn into something much more sinister. This happened to me about 6 months ago. I'm a college student. The guy who followed me into the bookstore. I was walking home from campus. It was around 4 p.m. on a Thursday, still plenty of daylight, and I was taking my usual route through downtown to get to my apartment. I first noticed him when I was about 3 blocks from campus. He was walking behind me, maybe 20 feet back, wearing a grey hoodie and jeans. At first I didn't think anything of it, because lots of people walk this route, and it's not unusual to end up walking in the same direction as other students or people getting off work. But after a couple blocks, I started to feel like something was off. I slowed my pace to see if he would pass me, but he slowed down too. When I sped up, he matched my pace. I took a left turn down a street that wasn't part of my usual route home, just to see what would happen. He turned left too. That's when I knew for sure he was following me. My heart started racing, and I tried to think of what to do. I didn't want to lead him to my apartment, but I also didn't want to be alone on some random street with him behind me. I remembered there was a bookstore called Pages and Pages about half a block ahead. It's this cozy little independent bookstore that's usually busy with college students and locals browsing. I figured I could duck in there, maybe lose him in the aisles, or at least be around other people where I'd feel safer. I walked into the bookstore, trying to act casual, like I'd been planning to stop there all along. The store has this layout with tall bookshelves creating different sections, so you can't see the whole store from the entrance. I immediately headed toward the back, hoping he wouldn't follow me inside, but less than a minute later, I saw him come through the front door. He didn't look around like someone who was actually shopping for books. Instead, he seemed to be scanning the store, clearly looking for someone, looking for me. I was in the poetry section at the back of the store, pretending to browse while keeping an eye on him through the gaps between books on the shelves. He started walking through the aisles systematically, like he was hunting. Every time I moved to a different section, he would follow a few minutes later. I went to the fiction section. 2 minutes later, there he was, pretending to look at novels, but clearly watching me. I moved to the history section. Same thing. Travel guides, science books, even the children's section in the back corner. Wherever I went, he would appear shortly after. Always with this fake browsing act, but never actually picking up a book or reading anything. The whole thing went on for about 20 minutes. I was getting more and more panicked, but I was trying to stay calm and think of a plan. The bookstore had other customers, but not many, and I didn't want to cause a scene if I was somehow wrong about what was happening. Finally, I decided to test him one more time. I walked toward the front of the store, like I was heading to the checkout counter, but instead of buying anything, I went straight to the magazine rack near the front window. I picked up a magazine and pretended to flip through it while watching the reflection in the glass. He had followed me to the front of the store and was now standing in the new releases section, which had a clear view of where I was standing. He wasn't even pretending to look at books anymore. He was just watching me. That's when I noticed the bookstore employee behind the counter, a woman probably in her 30s, also watching him with a concerned expression. She had clearly picked up on the weird dynamic happening in her store. I walked over to the counter and quietly was now following me around the store. She immediately understood and said she'd been wondering what was going on because his behaviour was obviously strange. She told me to stay right there at the counter while she handled it. I watched as she walked over to him and said loudly, "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you find a particular book or author? Are you looking for anything specific?" He mumbled something about just browsing and quickly headed for the door, but instead of leaving, he went outside and stood on the sidewalk right in front of the store window, obviously waiting for me to come out. The bookstore employee, whose name was Sarah, saw this too. She told me I could stay as long as I needed and offered to call the police. She also said there was a back exit that led to an alley behind the store if I wanted to leave without him seeing. I took her up on the back exit offer. She walked me to the rear door and even stepped outside with me to make sure the alley was clear. I thanked her profusely and took a completely different route home, going several blocks out of my way and even stopping at 2 other stores to make sure I wasn't being followed. By the time I finally got home, I was shaking. I kept thinking about how he had followed me for blocks, waited for me to go into the bookstore, and then spent 20 minutes tracking my every move inside. What would have happened if I hadn't gone into a public place? What if I had just kept walking home and led him straight to my apartment? I reported the incident to campus security and the local police. I gave them a description of the man and told them about the bookstore where it happened. The police officer said they'd increase patrols in that area and that I should trust my instincts if I ever felt like I was being followed again. I also went back to the bookstore a few days later to thank Sarah again. She said she was glad I had felt comfortable asking for help and that they'd had to deal with similar situations before. She told me they have a policy of always taking these concerns seriously and that any employee would do the same thing. It's been 6 months now and I've never seen that man again. But the experience changed how I think about walking alone, even in broad daylight, in areas I once considered safe. I'm much more aware of who's around me, and I always have a plan for where I could go if I needed to get away quickly. I still go to that bookstore regularly, and Sarah always greets me like a friend. I still go, and I always chat when I'm there. It's comforting to know there are people who will help when you're in a scary situation, even if they don't know you. This story really highlights how important it is to trust your instincts and seek help when something feels wrong. Sarah at the bookstore was an absolute hero for recognizing what was happening and taking action. The fact that this creep was so systematic about following through different sections of the store shows this wasn't some innocent misunderstanding. He'd clearly done this before and knew exactly what he was doing. Our next story takes us back in time to a childhood memory that's still haunting years later. The time. My babysitter's ex tried to break in. This happened when I was 8 years old, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. My parents had gone out for their anniversary dinner, and our regular babysitter Amanda was watching me and my younger sister Katie, who was 5 at the time. Amanda was 16 and had been babysitting us for about a year. She was really sweet and fun, always bringing craft projects or new games to play with us. My parents trusted her completely, and Katie and I loved when she came over. That night started out normal. Amanda made us mac and cheese for dinner, and we were all sitting on the living room floor, playing board games and watching Disney movies. Katie had fallen asleep on the couch around 8 p.m, and Amanda and I were quietly working on a puzzle, so we wouldn't wake her up. Around 9:30 we heard a car pull into our driveway. Amanda looked out the front window, and her whole demeanour changed instantly. The colour drained from her face, and she quickly stepped back from the window. "Who is it?" I asked, but she just told me to stay quiet and keep working on the puzzle. But I could tell something was really wrong. Her hands were shaking and she kept looking toward the door. Then we heard footsteps on the front porch, followed by loud knocking. Not normal knocking like when someone comes to visit, but aggressive pounding that shook the whole door. Amanda grabbed my hand and pulled me away from the living room, toward the back of the house. "Amanda!" a man's voice shouted from outside. "I know you're in there. Open the door." The scared and confused, and I started to cry a little. Amanda knelt down next. Knocking got louder and more violent. I was to me, and whispered that everything was going to be okay, but I could see in her eyes that she was terrified. "Amanda, open this door right now," the voice shouted again. "We need to talk." Katie, the noise, and started crying too. Amanda picked her up and carried her to our parents' bedroom at the back of the house. She told us both to stay there and be as quiet as possible while she called the police. But the man outside wasn't giving up. The pounding continued, and then we heard him trying the door handle, rattling it aggressively. He started walking around the house, and we could hear him trying the windows on the side of the house, then the back door. Amanda was on the phone with 911. Speaking could hear her saying, "He's trying," in a low urgent voice. I to get in, and please hurry, and giving our address. Katie both crying quietly. The worst part was Wen was clinging to me, and he came to the bedroom window where we were hiding. We heard him outside, just a few feet away from us, with only the glass and some curtains between us. He was saying Amanda's name over and over, sometimes angry, sometimes in this creepy, pleading voice. "I saw your car, Amanda. I know you're here. Just talk to me for 5 minutes. That's all I want." Amanda had pulled us into the walk-in closet and closed the door. We were sitting in complete darkness, listening to this man walk around our house, trying different ways to get in. She had her arms around both of us, and I could feel her whole body shaking. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. We heard the sirens, and then everything went quiet outside. Amanda waited until she heard the police officers calling her name before she let us out of the closet. When we came out of the bedroom, there were 2 police officers in our living room. They were asking Amanda questions about who the man was and what had happened. That night, I learned his name was Derek. He was Amanda's ex-boyfriend. Apparently, he had been stalking her for weeks. He had followed her to our house and had been waiting in his car across the street, watching until our parents left. The police said he had been drinking and was being arrested for attempted breaking and entering and harassment. My parents came home about an hour later to find police cars in our driveway, and all of us pretty shaken up. Amanda was crying and apologising, saying she never thought Derek would do something like this, and that she was sorry she had put us in danger. My parents were really understanding and supportive of Amanda. They told her it wasn't her fault, and that she had handled everything exactly right by calling the police and keeping us safe. But they also said it would be better if she didn't babysit for us anymore, until the situation with Derek was completely resolved. I found out years later that Derek had been stalking Amanda for months after their breakup. He'd been showing up at her school, at her job, and following her around town. That night at our house wasn't the first time he had tried to confront her, but it was the most aggressive incident. Amanda's parents ended up getting a restraining order against him, and he was eventually arrested again for violating it. Amanda moved away the next year to live with relatives in another state because she didn't feel safe staying in our town. I'm 23 now, and I still think about that night sometimes. As a kid, I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew it was scary and dangerous. Looking back as an adult, I realised how much worse it could have been if Derek had actually managed to get into our house. The whole experience taught me that dangerous situations can happen anywhere, even in places where you feel completely safe, like your own home. It also showed me how important it is for adults to take threats seriously and get help when someone is being stalked or harassed. I never saw Amanda again after she moved away, but I've always hoped she was able to get away from Derek permanently and build a safe, happy life somewhere else. She was just a teenager herself, dealing with something no 16-year-old should ever have to handle. That story is terrifying because it shows how someone else's dangerous situation can suddenly become yours. Amanda was just trying to do her job and earn some money babysitting, but her stalker ex-boyfriend turned a normal evening into a nightmare for everyone involved. The image of him circling the house like a predator, trying every possible entry point while 3 scared kids hid in a closet, is going to stick with me. Thank God Amanda had the presence of mind to call the police and get everyone to safety. Next story comes from someone who thought they had successfully lost their unwanted shadow. Some people are much more persistent than you'd ever want to imagine. The car that followed me for miles. I work late shifts at a restaurant downtown, usually getting off around midnight or later on weekends. It was a Saturday night about 2 months ago when this happened, and I was driving home after an especially long shift that ended around 1:30 a.m. My usual route home takes me through some pretty quiet residential areas, then onto a main road for about 10 minutes before I turn into my neighbourhood. The roads are usually empty at that hour, maybe 1 or 2 cars at most. About 5 minutes into my drive, I noticed headlights behind me. Nothing unusual about empty at that hour, maybe 1 or 2 other that, except these headlights stayed exactly the same distance behind me, even when I slowed down or sped up slightly. I started paying more attention, using my rear view mirror to keep track. When I turned left onto Maple Street, the car turned left too. When I took the right onto Harrison Avenue, same thing. I told myself I was being paranoid, because these are main roads that lots of people use. But after the 4th turn, all of which were pretty random residential streets that don't lead to major destinations, I knew for sure someone was following me. My heart started racing as I realised I was being deliberately tracked. I decided to test it by taking a route I'd never normally take, turning into a subdivision I'd never been in before. The headlights followed every single turn. I drove through this random neighbourhood for about 10 minutes, taking left turns, right turns, doubling back on streets, basically doing everything I could think of to lose them. But no matter what I did, those headlights stayed behind me. Not too close, but close enough that I could see them in my mirrors consistently. The really scary part was how patient they were. This wasn't some road rage situation where someone was tailgating me or trying to pass. They were maintaining perfect following distance, like they were professionals or something. Like they had all night and didn't mind waiting for me to lead them wherever I was going. I absolutely could not go home with this person following me. The last thing I wanted was for them to know where I lived, so I started driving toward the centre of town, trying to think of somewhere safe and public I could go, but it was almost 2 a.m. on a Saturday night. Everything was closed. The restaurants, the shops, even most of the gas stations were locked up for the night. I was running low on gas too, which was making me panic even more. Then I remembered there was a police station about 15 minutes away on the other side of town. I'd driven past it during the day, but never paid much attention to it. I wasn't even sure if anyone would be there at night, but it seemed like my best option. I started driving toward the police station, and the car continued following me. I was gripping my steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure they were still there. Part of me hoped they'd give up and turn away, but they didn't. As I got closer to the police station, I started to feel a little bit of relief. Just knowing I was heading somewhere safe made me feel less trapped. The police station was on a well-lit street with some 24-hour businesses nearby, so there would at least be some activity. When I finally saw the police station ahead, I slowed down and put on my turn signal. I watched in my rearview mirror to see what the following car would do. As soon as I signaled that I was turning into the police station parking lot, the car behind me suddenly accelerated and drove straight past. It happened so fast that I barely got a look at the vehicle. It was a dark sedan, maybe black or dark blue, but I couldn't see the license plate or get a good look at the driver. They just sped off into the night like nothing had happened. I sat in the police station parking lot for about 20 minutes, making sure they weren't coming back or waiting somewhere nearby. There were a couple of patrol cars in the lot and lights on inside the building, which made me feel safer. Finally, I decided to drive home, but I took a completely different route and kept checking my mirrors the entire time. I didn't see those headlights again, and I made it home without any further incident. I reported what happened to the police the next day. The officer I spoke with said they'd had a few similar reports over the past few months, and that I'd done exactly the right thing by driving to the station instead of going home. He said they'd increased patrols in the areas where these incidents had been happening. Ever since that night, I'm hyper aware of cars behind me when I drive home from work. I vary my route every night and always check to make sure I'm not being followed. I also keep more gas in my tank, so I don't have to worry about running out if something like this happens again. The scariest part is wondering what that person wanted and what would have happened if I had led them to my house. Were they just trying to scare me? Or did they have something worse planned? I'll probably never know, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and didn't find out the hard way. That story gives me chills because of how calculated and patient the stalker was. Following someone for miles through random neighborhoods at 2 a.m. takes a special kind of dedication to being creepy. The fact that they immediately fled when they realized their target was heading to a police station tells you everything you need to know about their intentions. Smart thinking driving to the station instead of home, because who knows what would have happened if they'd learned where you lived. Let's move to our next story, which proves that even innocent trips to the playground aren't always as safe as they should be. The man at the playground bench. I'm a college student, and last spring I was home for Easter break visiting my family. My mum asked me to take my 8-year-old sister Emma and her 2 friends to the playground at the local park while she prepared dinner for our extended family. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, probably around 3 p.m, and the playground was busy with families. Kids were running around on the equipment, while parents chatted on benches or pushed their toddlers on swings. It felt like a completely normal, safe environment. Emma and her friends immediately ran off to play on the jungle gym, while I found a spot where I could keep an eye on them, but also get some reading done for one of my classes. I was sitting at a picnic table about 20 feet away from the main play area. After about 15 minutes, I noticed a man sitting alone on one of the benches near the playground equipment. What caught my attention was that he didn't have any kids with him, which isn't necessarily weird, but he was very focused on watching the children play. At first I thought maybe he was waiting for someone, or just enjoying the nice weather. But as I continued to observe him, his behaviour started to seem off. He wasn't casually people-watching, like someone passing time. He was intensely focused on the kids, following specific children with his eyes as they moved around the playground. What really made me uncomfortable was that he had a small notebook and was writing things down. Every few minutes, he'd scribble something, then go back to watching the children. He seemed to be taking notes about what they were doing or how they looked. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, Maybe he was a researcher studying child development or playground safety. Maybe he was designing playground equipment and was observing how kids use different structures, but something about his whole demeanor felt wrong. The man was probably in his 40s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face and sunglasses, even though it wasn't that bright out. He had positioned himself in a spot where he could see the entire playground, but was partially hidden behind a tree from most of the parents' view. I started paying closer attention to what he was looking at, and I realized he was primarily focused on the little girls. When boys ran past his line of sight, his eyes didn't follow them. But when girls Emma's age or younger came into view, he would track their movements and then write something in his notebook. That's when I knew I needed to do something. I gathered up my textbooks and moved to a bench much closer to where Emma and her friends were playing. I wanted to be in a position where I could intervene quickly if needed, and I also wanted the man to know that someone was watching him. As soon as I moved closer, he noticed me looking at him. Our eyes met for just a second, and I could tell he realized I was suspicious of his behavior. He quickly closed his notebook and put it in his jacket pocket. But instead of leaving, he just sat there for another 10 minutes, no longer writing, but still watching the children. I kept my eyes on him the entire time, while also trying to keep track of Emma and her friends. Finally, I decided to be more direct about it. I walked over to a mum I'd been chatting with earlier and quietly explained what I'd observed. She immediately became concerned and said she'd noticed the man too, but had assumed he belonged to one of the other families. We agreed that she would keep an eye on him, while I went to find a park employee or call security. The park has a small office building with maintenance staff and a couple of people who manage events and rentals. I found a park employee named Mike and explained the situation. He said they'd had reports of suspicious individuals at the playground before and that he'd go check it out immediately. We walked back toward the playground together, but when we got there, the man was gone. The mum I'd spoken with said he'd left about 2 minutes after I walked away, moving quickly toward the parking lot. She said he'd seemed agitated when he left, like he knew he'd been caught doing something wrong. Mike asked me to describe the man in detail and said he'd file a report with the local police. He also said they'd increase security patrols around the playground area, especially during busy times when there were lots of children present. I told Emma and her friends it was time to go, making up some excuse about needing to get home for dinner. I didn't want to scare them, but I also didn't feel comfortable staying at the playground any longer. When I got home, I told my parents what had happened. My dad was furious and said he was going to call the police himself to make sure the incident was properly reported. My mum was upset that something like that could happen at a place where she'd always felt safe taking her kids. The police did follow up with me a few days later. They said they'd received similar reports about a man matching that description at playgrounds in 2 other towns nearby. They were investigating, but hadn't been able to identify him yet. I never saw the man again during the rest of my spring break, but the incident really changed how I think about public spaces that are supposed to be safe for children. It also made me realize how important it is to trust your instincts and speak up when something feels wrong, even if you're worried about overreacting. Emma and her friends never knew anything unusual had happened that day, which is probably for the best, but I made sure to talk to my parents about playground safety and what to watch out for when they take Emma to play in the future. That story is deeply unsettling because playgrounds should be the safest places for kids, but predators know that's exactly where they'll find vulnerable targets. The notebook detail is what really gets me, because it shows this wasn't casual observation, it was systematic documentation. Thank goodness you trusted your gut and took action, because who knows what he was planning to do with whatever information he was collecting. Our next story comes from someone who learned that even public transportation isn't always a refuge from creepy encounters. The stranger who sat beside me on the bus. This happened during my sophomore year of college, when I was taking evening classes and often had to ride the city bus home late at night. The bus route from campus back to my apartment usually took about 25 minutes, and the buses ran every half hour until midnight. It was a Tuesday night in October, probably around 10:30 p.m, and I was heading home after a study group session at the library. The bus was nearly empty, which was normal for that time of night. There were maybe 4 other passengers scattered throughout, all sitting by themselves with plenty of empty seats available. I chose a seat about halfway back on the right side, next to the window, so I could watch the stops and make sure I didn't miss mine. I put in my earbuds and started reviewing notes from my psychology class, trying to make productive use of the ride time. At the 3rd stop, a man got on the bus. I glanced up briefly when I heard the doors open, just out of habit, and saw him scanning the available seats. There were at least 15 empty rows to choose from, both in front of and behind where I was sitting. But instead of sitting in one of the many available spots, he walked straight down the aisle and slid into the seat right next to me. Not across the aisle, not in the row in front of or behind me, but directly beside me in a bus that was almost completely empty. My first thought was that maybe he hadn't seen the other empty seats, or maybe he preferred sitting in that particular spot for some reason. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt and just scooted closer to the window to give him more room, but then he immediately started trying to make conversation. He asked me what school I went to, what I was studying, where I was heading. I gave very short, polite answers, while keeping my earbuds in, hoping he'd take the hint that I didn't want to chat. He didn't take the hint. He kept asking more personal questions about my schedule, what classes I took, what days I usually rode this bus route. I started feeling uncomfortable, because these weren't normal small talk questions. They felt like he was gathering information about my routine. When I continued to give short answers and keep my attention on my notes, he moved closer to me on the seat. I was already pressed against the window, so I couldn't move any further away. That's when he leaned over and spoke directly into my ear, even though I had earbuds in. "I know where you live," he whispered. My blood went cold. I immediately pulled out my earbuds and turned to look at him, and he was smiling at me in this really creepy, knowing way. I asked him what he meant by that, and he just kept smiling and said, "I've seen you around the neighbourhood." I'd never seen this man before in my life. He was probably in his 30s with greasy hair and wearing a dirty jacket that smelled like cigarettes and something else I couldn't identify. There was no way he actually knew where I lived, unless he'd been following me or watching me without me knowing. I stood up immediately and moved to a seat at the very front of the bus, right behind the driver. The man didn't follow me, but I could feel him staring at me for the rest of the ride. Every time I glanced back, he was turned around in his seat looking directly at me. When my stop came up, I was terrified to get off the bus because I didn't want him to see exactly where I was going. But I also couldn't ride past my stop because the next one was in a much less safe area, and the buses stopped running soon. I decided to get off at my normal stop, but immediately started walking in the wrong direction, away from my apartment building. I figured if he was watching me through the bus windows, at least he wouldn't see which building I actually lived in. I waited until the bus pulled away and was completely out of sight before I doubled back toward my apartment. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time, expecting to see him following me on foot, but I didn't see anyone. When I finally got to my building, I ran up the stairs to my floor instead of taking the elevator, and I checked every lock on my door twice before I felt safe enough to try to relax. The next morning, I called the city bus transportation office and reported the incident. They said they'd make a note of it and increase driver awareness about passenger safety, but there wasn't much else they could do since the man hadn't technically threatened me or done anything illegal. I also talked to campus security about what had happened. They suggested I vary my schedule and routes when possible, and they offered to have someone walk me to the bus stop after evening classes if I felt unsafe. For the next few weeks, I was paranoid every time I rode the bus. I would scan every passenger who got on, terrified that I'd see that same man again. I also started paying much more attention to whether anyone seemed to be following me or watching my building. I never saw him again on the bus, but about a month later, I was walking home from the grocery store, and I swear I saw him sitting in a car parked across from my apartment building. I couldn't be completely sure it was the same person because I only got a quick look, but it looked like him, and the car drove away as soon as I noticed it. I ended up moving to a different apartment at the end of that semester, partly because of this incident and partly for other reasons. But I never felt completely safe in that building again after he'd implied that he knew where I lived. Looking back, I wish I had been more assertive about getting the bus driver involved when he first sat next to me and started asking personal questions. Sometimes, being polite can put you in more danger than being rude, and I learned that lesson the hard way, that whispered, "I know where you live," would have absolutely destroyed me. The calculated way he chose to sit right next to you in an empty bus, then immediately started fishing for information about your routine, is textbook predator behaviour. Moving apartments was probably the smartest thing you could have done, because someone that bold and persistent doesn't usually just give up after one encounter. Let's move to a story that proves even the supposed safety of your own home can be an illusion. The time someone tried my locked door at 3 a.m. I live alone in a small apartment on the second floor of an older building. It's generally a quiet, safe neighbourhood, and I'd never had any security concerns in the 2 years I'd been living there. My apartment door opens directly into a hallway that serves 4 units on my floor. This happened about 3 weeks ago on a Wednesday night. I'd gone to bed around 11 p.m. after a normal day at work. I'm usually a pretty heavy sleeper, so it takes a lot to wake me up once I'm out. But around 3 a.m, something woke me up. I wasn't sure what it was at first because I was still groggy and disoriented. I lay there for a minute listening, trying to figure out if I'd heard something or if it was just a dream. Then I heard it again, the sound of my door handle being turned very slowly and quietly. Not a quick turn like someone who belonged there would make, but a careful, deliberate movement like someone was testing to see if the door was locked. I held my breath and listened more carefully. The handle turned all the way down, and I could hear the mechanism clicking as whoever was out there tried to open my door. Thank God I always lock both the main deadbolt and the chain lock before bed. The person tried the handle several more times, each attempt lasting longer than the last. They weren't just checking once and leaving. They were really trying to get that door open. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid whoever was outside might be able to hear it. I carefully got out of bed and crept toward the door, trying not to make any noise that would let them know I was awake. When I got closer to the door, I could see shadows moving under the gap at the bottom. Whoever was out there was standing right outside my apartment, and from the way the shadows shifted, it looked like they were crouched down doing something. I heard a very faint scratching or scraping sound, like metal against metal. It took me a minute to realise what it was, but I think they were trying to pick my lock or manipulate it somehow. The scratching continued for several minutes. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering as quietly as I could about what was happening. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and said officers were on their way. She asked me to describe exactly what I was hearing and seeing. While I was still on the phone with dispatch, the scratching sound stopped, but the person didn't leave. I could still see the shadow of feet under my door, and I could hear very faint breathing sounds. Then something even more terrifying happened. Whoever was out there started speaking in a low whisper, just loud enough for me to hear through the door. "I know you're in there," the voice said. It sounded like a man, but it was hard to tell because he was speaking so softly. "I can hear you breathing." I froze completely. I hadn't made any noise that I was aware of, but somehow he knew I was awake and listening. The dispatcher on the phone could hear him too, and was trying to reassure me that help was almost there. "Open the door," he whispered again. "I just want to talk to you." I stayed perfectly still and didn't respond. After a few more seconds, he tried the door handle again, this time more aggressively. When it still didn't open, I heard him kick the door once, but not hard enough to break it down or make a lot of noise. Then I heard footsteps moving away from my door and toward the stairwell. The dispatcher told me to wait until the police arrived before opening my door, even if it seemed like the person had left. The officers got there about 5 minutes later. I could hear them in the hallway, talking and checking the stairwells. One of them knocked on my door and identified himself as police before I would open it. They searched the building and the surrounding area, but didn't find anyone. They said the hallway showed signs that someone had been tampering with my door lock. There were small scratches around the keyhole that hadn't been there before. The officers took a full report and said they'd increase patrols in the area. They also recommended I consider getting additional security measures, like a door camera or motion sensor lights for the hallway. One of the officers mentioned that they'd had a couple of similar reports in nearby buildings over the past month. Someone had been trying apartment doors late at night, apparently looking for unlocked units or easy targets. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of that night. I kept listening for sounds in the hallway and checking the locks every few minutes. Even now, 3 weeks later, I still have trouble sleeping, and I'm constantly aware of every noise in the building. I installed a doorbell camera the next day, and I've added extra locks to my door. I also started keeping a baseball bat next to my bed, just in case someone actually manages to get inside next time. The scariest part is wondering what would have happened if I hadn't locked my door properly, or if I was the type of person who didn't always engage the deadbolt. Would he have just walked right in while I was sleeping? I've become much more security conscious since this happened. I always check my locks multiple times before bed, and I've gotten to know my neighbours better so we can look out for each other. But I still get anxious every time I hear footsteps in the hallway at night. The whispered, "I know you're in there, and I can hear you breathing," is pure nightmare fuel. This person was clearly experienced at this because they knew exactly how to test locks quietly and could somehow detect that you were awake. The fact that this was part of a pattern happening to multiple buildings makes it even more terrifying because it shows this was someone's regular routine, not just a one-off incident. Our next story takes us into one of those situations that seems innocent at first but quickly reveals itself to be something much more sinister. The woman who smiled in the elevator. I work in a downtown office building, one of those older high-rise buildings with narrow hallways and elevators that move pretty slowly. My office is on the 15th floor, and I usually take the elevator up from the parking garage in the basement. This happened about 4 months ago on a Friday afternoon. I was running late getting back from lunch and rushed into the elevator in the lobby, pressing the button for my floor. Just as the doors were starting to close, a woman slipped in at the last second. She looked to be in her 40s, professionally dressed in a dark business suit, with her hair pulled back neatly. Nothing immediately unusual about her appearance, though she was carrying a large purse and seemed a little out of breath from hurrying to catch the elevator. I pressed 15 for my floor and then looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to press her button. But she just stood there next to the button panel, not pressing anything. "What floor?" I asked politely, assuming maybe she hadn't noticed I was waiting. She turned to look at me and smiled, but didn't answer. It wasn't a friendly, normal smile either. It was this wide, fixed grin that didn't reach her eyes. She just stood there staring at me with this unsettling smile. I figured maybe she was getting off at the same floor as me, so I didn't push it. The elevator started moving up, and I tried to focus on my phone to avoid the awkward silence, but I could feel her watching me the entire time. Every time I glanced up, she was still staring at me with that same creepy smile. She wasn't looking at the floor numbers or the doors or anywhere else, just directly at me. By the time we reached the 10th floor, I was getting really uncomfortable. The elevator was moving slowly, and we still had 5 more floors to go. I started wondering if I should get off early and take the stairs the rest of the way, just to get away from her. At the 12th floor, I decided to test something. I asked her again, "Are you sure you don't need to press a floor button?" Instead of answering, she took a step closer to me. We were in a small elevator, so there wasn't much room to begin with, but now she was standing uncomfortably close. Close enough that I could smell her perfume, which was overpowering and had this weird chemical scent to it. She was still smiling that same disturbing smile, but now she had tilted her head to one side, like she was studying me. It reminded me of how a bird looks at something it's curious about, except there was something predatory about her expression. When we reached the 14th floor, I made a decision. I was going to get off one floor early and take the stairs up to 15. I didn't care if it seemed rude or if I was overreacting. This woman was making me feel genuinely unsafe, and I trusted my instincts. As the elevator slowed down for the 14th floor, I moved toward the doors, ready to get off. But the woman moved too, positioning herself between me and the exit. She was still smiling, but now she was blocking my path to the doors. "Excuse me," I said, trying to step around her, but she shifted her weight to stay in front of me, still not saying a word. The doors opened, and I could see the 14th floor hallway right there, but she wasn't letting me pass. I started to panic because I realized she was deliberately trapping me in the elevator. "I need to get off here," I said more firmly, but she just kept smiling and shaking her head slowly from side to side, like she was telling a child they couldn't have something they wanted. The doors started to close again, and I reached around her to press the door open button. She grabbed my wrist with her hand, not violently, but firmly enough that I couldn't pull away. Her skin was ice cold, and her grip was much stronger than I would have expected. She was still smiling, but up close I could see that her pupils were dilated, and there was something very wrong with her expression. "Let go of me," I said loudly, hoping someone in the hallway might hear me, but the doors had already closed and we were moving up to the 15th floor. She held onto my wrist for a few more seconds, then released it and stepped back, but she was still blocking the elevator doors, and that smile never wavered. When we reached the 15th floor and the doors opened, I expected her to move aside and let me out since this was the floor I'd selected, but instead she stayed right where she was, standing in the doorway. I could see my office hallway behind her, and I knew there were people around who would hear me if I called for help. So I raised my voice and said, "I need you to move so I can get off this elevator right now." That seemed to break whatever spell she'd been under. The smile finally disappeared from her face, and she stepped aside without saying anything. I quickly moved past her and out of the elevator, but as the doors were closing behind me, I heard her speak for the first time. In this sing-song, childlike voice, she said, "See you soon, Noah." I spun around, but the doors had already closed and the elevator was moving. The thing that terrified me most was that she had used my name. I had never told her my name, and I wasn't wearing a name tag or anything that would have identified me. I stood in that hallway for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I kept looking back at the elevators, afraid she might come back up. When I got to my office, I immediately told my supervisor what had happened. She was concerned and said she'd contact building security to report the incident. She also suggested I avoid using the elevators alone for the rest of the day. Building security reviewed the elevator cameras and confirmed that everything I described was on video. They said the woman wasn't an employee in the building, and they had no record of her being signed in as a visitor anywhere. The security guard told me they'd had a few reports over the past month of a woman matching that description, acting strangely in the elevators and on various floors. Apparently, she'd been wandering around the building during business hours, but no one had been able to figure out how she was getting inside or what she wanted. They increased security patrols and added a requirement that all visitors had to be escorted by the person they were visiting. But I never saw the woman again, and after a few weeks, the reports from other floors stopped too. The part that still haunts me is how she knew my name. I've gone over it hundreds of times, trying to figure out if there was some way she could have learned it during our elevator ride, but there's no logical explanation. I still work in the same building, but I never take the elevators alone anymore. If I'm by myself, I always take the stairs, even though it's 15 flights. And whenever I do use the elevator with other people, I always make sure to stand near the buttons so I can control the doors if I need to. That story is absolutely chilling because elevators are such confined spaces where you're completely trapped if someone decides to mess with you. The detail about her knowing your name when you'd never told her is what pushes this into genuinely terrifying territory. The way she physically blocked your exit and grabbed your wrist shows this wasn't just some confused person. This was someone with a deliberate plan who saw you as a target. Let's move to our next story, which proves that even routine errands can turn dangerous when the wrong person takes an interest in you. The man in the grocery store aisle. I was doing my weekly grocery shopping on a Sunday afternoon at the big chain supermarket near my apartment. It's usually pretty busy on weekends, which I actually prefer because I feel safer when there are lots of people around. I had my list and was working my way through the store systematically, starting with produce and moving through the different sections. Nothing unusual about my routine, just picking up the basics I needed for the week ahead. I first noticed him in the produce section while I was selecting apples. He was a middle-aged man, probably in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap and a denim jacket. What caught my attention was that he seemed to be watching me rather than shopping for anything specific. When I moved on to the dairy aisle, I saw him again. He was standing near the milk, but he wasn't looking at the products. He was looking at me. When our eyes met briefly, he quickly turned away and pretended to be studying the yogurt selection. I told myself I was being paranoid and continued with my shopping, but as I moved through the store, I kept seeing him. Bread aisle, canned goods, frozen foods, every section I visited, he would appear a few minutes later. The pattern became impossible to ignore. He wasn't shopping with any purpose or efficiency. He wasn't putting anything in a cart or basket. He was just following me from aisle to aisle, always staying about 20 feet away, but clearly tracking my movements. In the cereal aisle, I decided to test my suspicions. I pretended to be very interested in a particular box of cereal, reading the ingredients and nutrition information carefully. I spent about 5 minutes in that spot, just waiting to see what he would do. He positioned himself at the end of the aisle and waited too. He picked up a box of crackers and held it, but I could tell he was watching me out of the corner of his eye. When I finally moved on, he immediately put the crackers back and followed. By this point, I was getting genuinely scared. This wasn't coincidental parallel shopping. This was deliberate stalking behavior, and I had no idea what his intentions were. I started walking faster and taking more random routes through the store, hoping to lose him, or at least make his following more obvious, but he kept pace with me, always maintaining that same distance, always appearing wherever I went. The most frightening moment came when I turned down the pet food aisle, which was relatively empty compared to the other sections. He followed me down there, and for the first time, we were essentially alone in a part of the store. He started walking directly toward me instead of maintaining his usual distance. I grabbed the first item I could reach, which happened to be a large bag of dog food, and held it in front of me like a shield while backing away from him. "Stay away from me," I said loudly enough that anyone nearby would hear. "Stop following me." He stopped walking toward me, but didn't leave the aisle. Instead, he just stood there staring at me with this blank expression. He didn't deny following me or try to explain his behavior. He just stared. I backed out of the aisle and headed straight for the front of the store, abandoning my shopping cart and most of the items I'd collected. I just wanted to get to the checkout area where there would be employees and other customers, but he followed me toward the front of the store too. As I got in line at one of the checkout lanes, he positioned himself near the customer service desk, where he could watch me, but wasn't obviously in line himself. I told the cashier what was happening while she scanned my items. She immediately called over a manager, who came over to ask me to describe the man and explain what had been going on. By the time I pointed him out, he was already walking quickly toward the exit. The manager followed him outside while another employee walked me to my car to make sure I got there safely. The manager came back and said the man had gotten into a car and driven away before he could approach him. He took down all my information and said they'd review the security footage to get a better look at the individual. He also said they'd had similar complaints from other customers over the past few weeks, and they suspected it was the same person. Apparently, he had a pattern of following women shoppers, particularly those who appeared to be shopping alone. They filed a report with the local police and said they'd increase security presence in the store, especially during busy weekend hours when he seemed most active. They also gave me their direct number to call if I ever saw him again. I didn't go back to that store for about a month after the incident. When I did finally return, I shopped during off-peak hours and stayed hyper-aware of everyone around me. I also started varying which grocery store I used, so I wouldn't have such a predictable routine. I never saw that particular man again, but the experience changed how I think about personal safety during routine activities. Now I always pay attention to whether anyone seems to be following me or showing unusual interest in my movements. It's scary to think that something as normal as grocery shopping can attract the attention of someone with bad intentions. The fact that he'd apparently been doing this to other women makes it even more disturbing because it shows this was a deliberate pattern of behaviour, not just some random encounter. That methodical stalking through every single aisle is what makes this so terrifying. He turned a grocery store into his hunting ground, preying on women who were just trying to get their weekly shopping done. The fact that he'd been doing it to multiple customers shows this was his regular routine. Thank goodness the manager and staff took it seriously and helped get you to safety. Our next story comes from someone whose daily bus ride turned into something far more sinister. The creep who stared through the bus window. I take the city bus to work every morning, and it's usually a pretty peaceful part of my day. I like to sit by the window and watch the neighbourhoods go by while listening to music or catching up on podcasts. The route takes about 30 minutes, and I've been doing this commute for almost 2 years without any problems. About a month ago, something started happening that completely changed how I feel about public transportation. I was sitting in my usual spot on the right side of the bus, about halfway back, when I noticed a man walking on the sidewalk parallel to our route. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Lots of people walk along this street, and it's not unusual to see pedestrians going in the same direction as the bus for a few blocks. But this guy wasn't just walking casually, he was keeping pace with the bus exactly, and he was staring directly at me through the window. When the bus stopped at red lights, he would stop too. When we accelerated, he would speed up his walking to match our speed. This went on for about 6 blocks, which is way longer than anyone would normally walk in the same direction as a bus. Unless they were deliberately, myself it was just coincidence, but following it, I tried to convince when I looked at him more carefully. I could see that his eyes were locked onto mine. He wasn't looking at the bus in general, or at other passengers. He was specifically focused on me, and when I moved positions in my seat, his gaze followed. The really creepy part was his expression. He wasn't just casually looking in my direction. He had this intense, focused stare, and there was something about his face that made my skin crawl. He looked like he was studying me, memorizing details about what I looked like. After about 10 blocks of this, I thought surely he would turn off onto a side street or stop following the bus. But he didn't. He kept walking at the exact same pace, never losing sight of me, never looking away for more than a few seconds. Other passengers were starting to notice too. The woman sitting across from me kept glancing between me and the window, clearly seeing what was happening. An older man near the front of the bus actually stood up and moved to get a better look at the guy outside. At one point, the bus had to stop for a longer red light, and the man outside stopped directly next to my window. He was maybe 3 feet away from me, with just the glass between us. He pressed his face close to the window and just stared at me with this horrible smile. I could see every detail of his face clearly. He was probably in his 40s with stubble and greasy hair, wearing a dark jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. But what scared me most was his eyes. They had this vacant, predatory look that made me feel like he was seeing me as prey rather than as a person. When the light turned green and the bus started moving again, he immediately resumed his walking pace to keep up with us. By this point, I was genuinely terrified and didn't know what to do. I couldn't get off the bus because that would put me on the street with him, but I couldn't just sit there and let him continue stalking me either. I decided to move to a seat on the opposite side of the bus, hoping that would break his line of sight and maybe discourage him from continuing to follow. But when I moved, he crossed the street and started walking on the other side, so he could keep watching me through the left side windows. The bus driver had noticed what was happening by now, and he radioed something to dispatch. I could hear him talking quietly into his radio about a pedestrian who was following the bus and harassing passengers. For the next several blocks, this man continued to pace the bus perfectly, crossing back and forth across the street whenever I moved to different seats, never taking his eyes off me. It was like being trapped in a mobile fishbowl with a predator circling outside. Finally, when we were about 5 blocks from my work stop, he suddenly stopped walking and just stood on the sidewalk watching as the bus continued without him. I looked back through the rear window and saw him standing there in the same spot, still staring at the bus until we disappeared around a corner. I was shaking when I got off at my work stop. I immediately called the bus company to report what had happened, and they said they'd already received the driver's report about the incident. They assured me they'd file a report with transit police and increase security awareness on that route. I also called the police myself and gave them a detailed description of the man. They said they'd have patrol officers pay extra attention to that area, especially during morning commute hours when I usually take the bus. For the past month, I've been varying my schedule and taking different routes to work when possible. On days when I do take the same bus, I sit in different seats and keep my phone ready to call for help if I see him again. I haven't seen the man since that day, but the experience has completely changed how I feel about my commute. What that day has become something I approach with anxiety used to be a relaxing start to my work and hypervigilance. The scariest part is wondering what would have happened if I had gotten off the bus while he was following me. Would he have approached me? Was he planning something, or was he just getting some sick thrill from terrifying a stranger? I keep thinking about how helpless I felt being trapped on that bus with him, tracking my every movement from outside. It was like being in a cage while a predator circled around, and there was nothing I could do to escape his attention until he decided to stop on his own. That story ends there. The image of someone pacing a moving bus for miles while maintaining constant eye contact is absolutely horrifying. This wasn't some random encounter, it was sustained, calculated harassment. The fact that he crossed streets just to keep staring shows how determined he was to terrorize you. Thank goodness the bus driver took it seriously and reported it, because that level of obsessive behavior rarely stops on its own. Our next story comes from someone whose morning jog turned into a terrifying chase. The jogger who followed me to my doorstep. I've been running the same route through my neighbourhood for about 3 years. It's a nice loop that takes me through some quiet residential streets, past a small park and back to my apartment complex. I usually go out around 6 a.m. when there's not much traffic and the air is still cool. Last Tuesday started like any other morning. I did my usual warm-up stretches and headed out for what I expected to be a normal 45-minute run. The sun was just starting to come up, and there were a few other early morning joggers and dog walkers out, which always makes me feel safer. About 10 minutes into my run, I noticed another jogger behind me. He was maybe 50 yards back, running at a steady pace in the same direction I was going. I didn't think much of it because people use this route all the time, and it's not unusual to see other runners going the same way. But after a few more minutes, I realised he was maintaining exactly the same distance behind me. When I sped up slightly, he sped up too. When I slowed down to catch my breath at a hill, he slowed down as well. It was like he was deliberately matching my pace instead of running his own workout. I decided to test whether this was intentional by taking a detour from my usual route. Instead of continuing straight on Maple Street like I normally do, I turned left onto a side street that leads into a residential area I don't usually run through. The other jogger turned left too. That's when I knew for sure that something was wrong. This side street doesn't connect to any major running routes or parks. The only reason to turn down there would be if you lived in that neighbourhood, or if you were following someone. Yet I could still hear his steps behind me, steady and deliberate, about 50 yards back. I could hear his foot. I kept expecting him to turn off onto one of the side streets if he actually lived in the area, but he didn't. He stayed right behind me, no matter which way I turned. My heart started beating faster, and not just from the physical exertion of running. I was getting genuinely scared because I was leading this stranger deeper into quiet residential streets where there might not be anyone around to help if he tried something. I decided to head back toward the main road where there would be more traffic and hopefully other people, but when I turned around to go back the way I came, he turned around too, still staying that same distance behind me. Now, I was really panicking. This wasn't some coincidental parallel running. This was deliberate stalking behaviour, and I had no idea what his intentions were or what I should do about it. I started running faster, hoping to lose him, or at least get back to a busier area where I could find help, but he matched my increased pace effortlessly. In fact, I got the impression he was probably a stronger runner than me, and was holding back to stay behind me rather than running at his full capacity. When I reached the main road again, I looked around desperately for somewhere public I could go. There was a gas station about 2 blocks away that was open, and I decided to run there and ask the attendant for help. But as I headed toward the gas station, the jogger behind me started closing the distance. Instead of staying 50 yards back like he had been, he was now maybe 20 yards behind me and gaining ground. I could hear his breathing getting closer, and I realised he was going to catch up to me before I could reach the safety of the gas station. So I made a split-second decision to change direction and run toward my apartment complex, which was closer. I sprinted as fast as I could toward my building, with him now right behind me. I could hear his footsteps getting closer and closer, and I was terrified that he was going to grab me before I could get inside. When I reached my building, I fumbled with my keycard to get through the security door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely swipe the card, and I could sense him right behind me on the other side of the door. I finally got the door open and slammed it shut behind me, immediately engaging the manual lock. Through the glass door, I could see him standing just a few feet away on the other side, breathing heavily and staring at me. He didn't look angry or frustrated like someone whose innocent morning run had been interrupted. He looked calm and calculating, like he had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. That expression on his face scared me more than anything else about the whole encounter. He stood there for about 30 seconds, just watching me through the glass. Then he smiled, turned around, and jogged away like nothing had happened. I went straight up to my apartment and called the police to report what had occurred. They took a detailed description and said they'd have patrol cars check the area during morning hours when joggers are typically out. I also reported it to my apartment complex's management, and they said they'd review the security camera footage from the entrance to get a better look at the man who had followed me. It's been a week now, and I haven't been running since that morning. I'm too scared to go out alone, especially on my usual route where he might be waiting for me. I've been using the treadmill at my gym instead, which isn't the same, but at least feels safe. The police never found him, and the security cameras only got a partial view of his face because he was wearing a baseball cap pulled low. But I'll never forget that calculating smile he gave me before he jogged away. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't made it inside my building in time, or if I had tried to run somewhere else instead of leading him straight to where I live. Now he knows where I live, and that thought terrifies me. That story's over. The way he smiled at the end after chasing you to your door is pure nightmare fuel. He wasn't just following you, he was hunting you, and that final expression shows he got exactly what he wanted out of the encounter. The fact that he now knows where you live makes this so much worse than a random street harassment. Smart move switching to the gym, because someone that determined and calculated doesn't usually just give up after one successful hunt. Let's move to a story that shows how even the simple act of getting in your car can become dangerous. The night I found someone under my car. I work late shifts at a restaurant downtown, and I usually don't get off until around midnight or later on weekends. The employee parking lot is behind the building, kind of tucked away from the street, but it's well lit, and I'd never had any problems there before. This happened on a Saturday night, about 6 weeks ago. I had just finished closing duties and was walking out to my car around 12:30 a.m. It had been a busy night, and I was exhausted and looking forward to getting home. My car is a small sedan, and I usually park in the same general area of the lot when possible. As I approached it that night, something made me stop before getting in. The parking lot seemed normal, maybe just a feeling that something was off, but I paused and looked around. There were a few other employee cars still there, and the lighting was adequate. Nothing looked obviously wrong or dangerous. But I still had this nagging feeling that I should be more careful than usual. Instead of just unlocking my car and getting in like I normally do, I decided to walk around the vehicle first and do a quick visual check. I'm not sure what made me think to do this, but I'm so glad I did. When I got to the driver's side of my car, I bent down to look underneath before getting in, and that's when I saw him. There was a man lying flat on his back under my car, positioned right where my legs would be when I got into the driver's seat. He was wearing dark clothing and had on black gloves, and he was completely motionless, like he was trying not to be detected. I immediately jumped back and screamed. The man started scrambling out from under my car, moving surprisingly quickly for someone who had been lying flat on asphalt. I ran back toward the restaurant, screaming for help as loud as I could. Several of my co-workers who were still inside heard me and came running out to see what was happening. By the time they reached me, the man had gotten out from under my car and was running across the parking lot toward the street. It was dark and he was moving fast, so none of us got a good look at his face. But we could see that he was wearing all black clothing and appeared to be carrying something in his hand. My manager immediately called the police while my co-workers walked me back to my car to see if anything had been damaged or tampered with. We couldn't see any obvious signs that he had done anything to the vehicle, but the thought of what he might have been planning was terrifying. The police arrived within about 10 minutes and took a detailed report. They examined my car thoroughly, checking for any signs of sabotage or tracking devices. They also dusted around the area where he had been lying for fingerprints, though they said the chances of finding usable prints were slim. One of the officers explained that this was a known tactic used by people with various criminal intentions. Sometimes they're planning to grab someone's ankles when they get in the car. Sometimes they're trying to access the vehicle's underside to plant tracking devices or disable it. And sometimes they're waiting for an opportunity to carjack or assault the driver. He said the fact that the man was wearing gloves suggested he had come prepared and had probably done this before. The officer also commended me for trusting my instincts and checking under the car before getting in, because that probably prevented whatever he had been planning. My manager arranged for one of my co-workers to follow me home that night, just to make sure I wasn't being followed, or that the man hadn't somehow learned where I lived. I was shaking the entire drive home and kept checking my mirrors constantly. The next day, I went to an auto shop and had them do a complete inspection of my car to make sure nothing had been tampered with or attached to it. Everything checked out fine, but I wanted to be absolutely certain. I also bought one of those small flashlights that I now carry with me specifically for checking under my car before I get in. It's become part of my routine every single time I approach my vehicle, especially when I'm alone or in a dimly lit area. The restaurant installed additional security lighting in the employee parking lot and put up cameras covering all the parking spaces. They also implemented a policy where closing employees are supposed to walk out together rather than leaving alone. I never found out who the man was or what exactly he was planning to do. The police investigated, but said without a clear description of his face or any physical evidence, it was difficult to pursue. They did increase patrols in that area during late night hours. It's been 6 weeks, and I still get nervous every time I approach my car, especially after dark. I always check underneath and all around the vehicle before getting in, and I try to park in the most well-lit areas possible. The scariest part is thinking about what would have happened if I had just gotten into my car normally that night. Would he have grabbed my legs? Would he have tried to prevent me from starting the car? Would he have followed me home? I'll probably never know what his intentions were, but I'm grateful every day that I trusted that weird feeling I had and decided to look before getting in my car. That's the batch for tonight. If you enjoyed these stories, consider subscribing for more, as I read stories just like these every night. Other than that, stay safe and keep your doors locked. And remember that sometimes being rude might just save your life. Take care.